ahead and call to order the September 7th, 2021 Eugene Water and Electric Board meeting. So we are just going to launch right into our agenda because we have a full evening, and we're going to start with our agenda check. Is there anything that anybody wants to comment on the agenda? I see lots of no's, so we'll say we're good to go on the agenda. Next, we're going to move on to items from board members and the general manager. I will just start off by saying that I know that today is the 1-year anniversary of the Holiday Farm fire, so I just wanted to acknowledge that. I know that later we're going to get an update on the recovery work that's going on upriver, so I don't know if that was planned exactly for this time or it's just coincidence, but my hearts go out to all the people that were affected by the fire, and it will be heartening to hear some of the good things that are happening now in terms of recovery. And I believe that is all that I have. If it's okay with commissioners, I might just call on you as I see you on my screen. So I will start with John Borofsky.
Thank you. The only thing that I would like to say is in the past month or so, my business has been targeted by some people that weren't happy with the decision that I made as an Eweb commissioner regarding the 40th and Hilliard water treatment or water tanks. I just want to let people know that, you know, this has been a real difficult time for my industry as a whole and our business in particular. And I just hope that moving forward, people will keep my business and my employees that I've tried to employ through this difficult period separate from my position as an Eweb commissioner and the decisions that I need to make therefore. I just hope that that's something we can keep separate in the time moving forward, and that's all I'd like to say. Thank you.
I'm really sorry to hear that. Sonia.
I also wanted to acknowledge I won't repeat anything that Mindy said, but that was the item on my agenda as well. Just, you know, acknowledging that we're at 1 year here and sending thoughts and best wishes out to those who have been, you know, greatly affected and who are also being affected by other fires throughout the region currently. Thank you for everyone's help to help those recover and put us in a better place moving forward.
Matt.
Thanks, Mindy. I'll echo that. Just acknowledging where we are a year from the fire. I know it's a really hard time for folks who have been affected by the fires. I also want to acknowledge that we are in the middle of a COVID spike that is, you know, high risk and compounds the difficulty for people who are trying to recover from wildfire, as well as the rest of the community trying to go about their regular business. And I want to again acknowledge our technical team and our support staff who continue to pivot and adjust to make all of these meetings work flawlessly. Thanks to the team behind the scenes here, making this all happen. Thanks.
John Brown.
Yeah, thank you. And number one, the other John B. I too am sorry to hear that because I have experienced some of that with, I've got hundreds of signs around town and every once in a while we get a lovely little note. But that aside, I know one thing that we as a board could do to help, and that's always go out to dinner more often, you know, and have a nice little, I mean, that's a win-win if you ask me, and we haven't been doing any of these meals lately, so why not? Frank, take a hint. The other thing I'd like to acknowledge Matt and everybody else doing things that the salmon are starting to run back up over the dam, and I would like to just thank Eweb and the employees and everybody for working with ODFW and everybody else, because It's been a tough year for everything and everybody, and Mother Nature especially, and to see that the salmon are start coming back up into the ladder and going over and going up into the spawning grounds is a great thing. And I think Eweb has been cooperating with ODFW and others to help that process through, because of, especially with the Weaver shutdown. So thank you.
All right, Frank, last but not least. You're muted.
I am muted. You'd think I'd be used to this by now. Commissioners, good evening. I did have a couple of updates I wanted to share this evening. I was going to mention, unfortunately, we are still operating in the COVID environment. Thus, we have this meeting and also our operational protocols specific to the present conditions in effect at Eweb. For example, right now we do have 14 employees covering 8 departments that are in quarantine. And so we continue to work within that environment, and we'll continue to do so as long as necessary. Second, I'd also like to mention that the specific payment processing incident with Eweb's merchant services provider, that was Avalon, which is a US Bancorp subsidiary, is close to being resolved. The issue did not only impact Eweb, but also other customers, mostly commercial customers of Avalon. And other than the timing coincidence, this issue had nothing to do with Eweb's new customer portal. Avalon since then has reversed the inaccurate payments and will reprocess the correct payments sometime around the middle of this week, potentially Wednesday. Even though this was technically not an Eweb issue, we did treat it as such because it manifested itself that way with our customers. And so we adjusted our communications and response accordingly. And even during what is normally a really busy time of year for us with college move-ins and other things, I did want to thank our customer service agents and our communication staff who were really inundated with this issue for their assistance with what were a few pretty upset customers, understandably so. And also, I wanted to commend those who worked to diagnose and develop solutions to the problem. But again, the timing was quite unfortunate, but it was an issue with our payment processor. And then finally, I would like to also acknowledge the 1-year anniversary of the Holiday Farm fire. We have many partners that we worked with that we'd like to thank over the last year to help the McKenzie Valley and the watershed start to recover. The recovery is still ongoing. We do have some media releases coming out later this week, some videos. We'll also have a two-page insert in the Eugene Weekly highlighting some of the recovery work that's taken place so far in the past year and acknowledging some of the partnerships that have developed. And so those were 3 of my items. I appreciate the opportunity to give the board an update, and I'll pass it back to you.
Great. Sonia, did I see that you had something to add?
Yes, I did. I forgot I wanted to ask because I had a number of people reach out to me through various means about the payment system and troubles with getting into the new payment processor. And I was curious, for those citizens who did receive erroneous payments that may have resulted in overdraft charges, I think we were told that we can help that. Is there a way to proactively work with the banks to get those reversed so people don't have to call in every time to get that? Is that something that we can do, to continue to rectify that? Yeah,
Commissioner Carlson, I will channel my inner Deborah. She can actually weigh in if she wants to, but I believe customers can work directly with their banks to reverse a lot of those charges, especially if a customer worked with their bank originally to identify this as a incorrect or fraudulent charge. And I'm not sure if fraudulent is the right word, inaccurate charge. So they can work with their bank directly. Is that correct, Deborah?
Halfway there. So in the event that that a customer did work directly with their financial institution early on and advised them that the amount was unauthorized, then the financial institution would handle that. Unfortunately, the only way we know that a charge that a customer has incurred a charge as a result of this is if they reach out to us, and we'll make it as straightforward as possible to make sure that they're reimbursed. Some banks have heard from us, and credit unions, we have had some correspondence throughout the process, but not able to universally request that anything associated with this be automatically reversed, and that we would handle that.
Okay, thank you. It's a shame that we couldn't, but I understand it's a tricky situation, and I appreciate everybody's attention to jumping on to try to fix it. Again, I understand it's not something that we started, but we definitely have to make it right with our customers. So appreciate your work for that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
John?
you, Deborah.
Yeah, and Mindy, sorry, I forgot one other thing too. Frank, could we get kind of an update on the call hold times? Because, I experienced 30 minutes, and I've seen other people complaining about 30 to 45 minutes. And to me, that's just unacceptable. I mean, I know it's a situation, but is that just the exception and not the rule now? Or could you get back to me on what the average wait time is and everything? Because when I experienced it, it was not an exception. It was pretty much standard. You waited for 30 minutes is a long time to sit and listen to that music. And can you sum up that?
Sure. Yep, we can get back to you with the full details. Those kinds of hold times are unacceptable to us too. We have to be careful about looking at average versus peak hours, and so we'll try to get more of that detail to you and the rest of the commissioners.
Thank you.
All right. And are both of the people who signed up for public testimony here at the meeting?
Yes, they are.
Great. Then we will go on to agenda item number 3, which is input via telephone. And when your name is called, remember to unmute your call. You can press *6 if you're calling from a landline, or simply use the unmute button if calling from your cell phone. Please state your name and optionally your address or ward, and speak clearly into the phone. Each speaker will be offered 3 minutes to present their testimony. Please keep track of time, although we will give you a reminder, and you'll hear an audio notification when 3 minutes has lapsed. After all testimony is heard, each commissioner will have an opportunity to speak if they choose, although by policy, we do not engage in a back and forth dialogue. Please note that failure of a commissioner to speak shall not be construed as support of or opposition to any speaker's testimony. If a question is presented by a speaker and the board does not provide an answer, an Eweb staff member will contact the speaker so that the question can be addressed at a later time. So the public testimony period for this meeting is now open. If I had a gavel, I would gavel in. And we have 2 speakers signed up tonight. So first we have Mark Rabinowitz, followed by Marilyn Block. So Mark, you're up.
Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Today, of course, is the anniversary of the Holiday Farm fire. I call it the Weyerhaeuser fire, given where most of the burning was. And I have 2 questions for Eweb. Has Eweb ever, over the decades, said anything about conversion of forests into the tree farms that were much more flammable? I'm also curious if Eweb has ever objected to Weyerhaeuser Corporation spraying poison from helicopters over the Mackenzie watershed, since that flows downstream into the drinking water intake. And a suggestion. You're about to appropriate a little more money for the contractor that has been clear cutting your reservoir site. It would be awfully nice if you require them to have covers for the dump trucks so they don't spew dust all over South Eugene. And maybe you could use the water line you added to the site to wet down the dust. The air is officially unhealthy today in Eugene, and at 3 o'clock this afternoon, the count in Fall Creek was 1,471. 1,471. And I hope that all the commissioners and the senior staff at Eweb managed to take a look and smell your forest as it was being cut down. It would be nice to consider that, you know, we're not really such a green city in Eugene. We were formed cutting down one of the nicest forests on the planet. And the distance from East 40th to your new compound in the West Eugene wetlands is the breathable thickness of the atmosphere. In other words, if you went 7 miles straight up, you would no longer be able to breathe properly. And everything we do in that thin film of the atmosphere will impact our great-great-great-grandchildren, but of course you all know that. And finally, I appreciated the documents I got from the public records request, especially of the cracked walls in Hawkins Hill Tank. And it suggests a lack of maintenance for a couple of decades, since we've known about the subduction zone for over 35 years. And if these tanks were to break open in a seismic event, what would be the impact of downhill neighbors for Hawkins Hill or College Hill? And why is there no public discussion of that? I would love to see Eweb provide a formal response about the dangers of these tanks to downhill neighbors.
Thank you. Next up, we have Marilyn Block.
Okay, I'm Marilyn Block. I live in Ward 2, and I wanted to comment on the contractor's work up at 40th and Patterson. Starting off with the cutting down the trees, pretty much all happened in one day. I heard that the time allotted to it was 6 to 8 weeks, and the trees were falling down on top of each other and cracking, breaking them, and good-sized trees were being ground up. I'd heard ahead of time that you were going to make some into benches in the city, and I'd like to know how that project is going. Also, I wanted to talk about the same thing that Mark did about the trucks are not covered and they're not wetted down. So a friend followed one and got pelted with dirt and rocks, and there's dirt and rocks along the gutter heading down Hilliard. It's adding pollution, and I wonder if it's even legal to do that. So I hope you can do something about covering them up. And also, I'd like to know how much more money it's going to cost so far to do this project. How much have you added to the project? And one last request is, when you call on the commissioners to speak at the beginning of the meeting, could you please say their whole names and maybe the fact that they are commissioners? I would appreciate it. Listening, I'd appreciate that. It just seems like a courteous thing to do. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So those are all the public speakers we have. So the public testimony period for this meeting is now closed. At this time, commissioners are given the opportunity to comment if they choose. So I don't know if this time if people want to raise their hands, and then I can call on you. And I will start with Commissioner Sonia Carlson. That was a good reminder of me to use everybody's full name.
Okay, well, thank you both. Appreciate the public testimony. Some good ideas in there. I definitely agree with looking at how to cover the trucks and mitigate the impact there. I do think those things can be very dangerous with large gravel coming off, either covering it or, you know, wetting it down if there's a way to do that. We certainly don't want to add any other pollution. And so I would be supportive of, you know, staff reviewing what can be done there to make sure that that impact is lightened in that community as much as possible. And I also appreciate the other comments, particularly the, you know, names. I think that one is a very important one. I noticed it myself when I was going back and reviewing the audio from the previous meeting. So anyway, thank you again for your comments, and I'll leave it to others to make others.
All right, I don't see any other hands at this point, but this is Mindy Schlossberg, and I will just again reiterate that the using of the first names is on me. I think that I've been pushing back a little bit about some of the formality of these meetings and have become a little too casual. So thank you for that reminder that I will use everybody's full name, and that will make it a little bit easier. And hopefully we're just in a little bit of a blip for having virtual meetings, and maybe soon we'll be back in person and it won't be an issue. Is there anybody else who would like to make a comment? Yes, Commissioner McCray.
Thanks, Mindy. Very briefly, I trust our project team will take a look at the dust complaints and make sure we're doing all we can to mitigate the dust rocks. And once it starts raining, the mud on that site, I trust we'll do everything we can, and appreciate the concerns being brought to us. The other one about the seismic comment about our reservoirs. My understanding is that that is a primary driver for our fairly quick-paced replacement of many of these exact reservoirs. So yes, they're an issue, and I think we are moving as quickly as we possibly can to eliminate or at least substantially reduce that risk. Thanks for bringing it up. That's all I have. Thank you, Mindy.
Commissioner Borowski.
Thank you, and thank you for your testimony, people. One of the questions was, how much more money are we spending in addition to what's already been budgeted? That's an item that's coming up in our consent calendar, and a couple of them go directly to some of the concerns that were raised in public comment. There's an increase of about $9,000 for rock that we put up on the site to cut down on the dust, so that when the heavy equipment's moving around, it's not pushing up a lot of dust. I know that doesn't specifically speak to the dust that's coming off of the trucks, but it was a increased cost that we felt was well worth it. We also spent a couple $1,000s to have the crews leave some snags for habitat for wildlife up there. And then we also incurred the ratepayers, I should say, incurred a rather substantial cost of about $24,000 for the delay that was imposed on us by the stay. We had to pay the contractors that were there to basically not work, and that was almost a $24,000 hit to our ratepayers. So that's where the increase in the budget that's going to be coming up in our consent calendar.
Frank.
Yes, commissioners, this is Frank Lawson for the record. I will reiterate that throughout the course of this project, staff will continue to, and I think as Commissioner McCray stated, we'll continue to look at the protocols for mitigating noise, for mitigating dust, later mud, and a number of other construction related activities. It's very unlikely that we will cover dump trucks. That's pretty impractical, but some of the other things mentioned are a possibility, how we load those, to what extent, and to some other protocols relative to keeping the dust down. So there's some things, but staff will continue to review those. I'm not sure if the question on price was related to the additional cost of some of the items that Commissioner Borofsky mentioned, which are sort of incremental items because of activities over the last month or so, or the additional cost of doing the second tank instead of doing 2 tanks instead of 1, and that's covered quite extensively throughout the course of the last year and a half, and specifically was covered last April in the record of decision associated with the finances of the project. So there's a number of things. I would also add in the watershed, our watershed protection program is pretty extensive when it comes to looking at data relative to forestry activities. And so that is something that is covered pretty extensively in some of our source protection work. So there's information out there, but I will, commit the fact that staff will continue to monitor the protocols at the East 40th site and try to mitigate those things that impact neighbors as we go forward as best we can. Thank you.
All right. There's no other comments, then we will move on to our board action items. Agenda item number 4, approval of consent calendar A.
Move to adopt consent calendar A.
Second, that's Sonia.
All those in favor, raise your hand and say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Nope. Okay, so consent calendar A passes. Moving on to item number 5, approval of consent calendar B.
Move to adopt consent calendar B by Commissioner Brown.
Second.
All right. All those in favor, raise your hand and say aye.
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 All right. Consent calendar B was approved. Moving right along to our general business items, to the meat of the meeting. Item number 7, the COSA, cost of service analysis discussion.
This will be Deborah Hart and Adam Rue. So I guess Deborah, our Chief Financial Officer, will kick this off. Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you. Good evening, commissioners. As General Manager Lawson said, myself and the Fiscal Services Supervisor, Adam Rue, are here this evening for a cost of service analysis discussion. Holly, could I get the next slide? So this evening we're going to start off with a brief overview of some industry trends that we're seeing. Follow that with a review of the electric system as it pertains to COSA analysis. Then move on to water. Adam Rue will also be providing a model overview of the cost of service. We'll dig a little deeper into the allocation factors and then review next steps. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Adam.
Thanks, Deborah. Next slide, please. So before we got into the cost of service detail, I wanted to provide some context related to industry trends that might be impacting or informing the broader rate design issue. So when we think about electrification impacts on load or need to modernize infrastructure, as well as for the electric utility growing renewable energy supplies and energy market volatility, as well as climate and regulatory changes. Those are factors that might influence future rate design discussion and issues. So next slide, please. So there's a strategic organizational goal related to cost of service and rate making. Alignment with strategic objectives and organizational policies and goals is an important consideration for rate design and in turn cost of service analysis. So this is some language from the strategic plan. Next slide. So the memo addresses kind of three phases of the rate making process. The purpose of this presentation is really to look at the middle one, the cost of service analysis, but we'll also touch on the revenue requirement, which we address in our budget process, as well as rate design, which is a board touch point where rates are approved by the board every year. So next slide, please. So here's kind of a simple image of an electric system that will kind of highlight some of the issues related to cost allocation. It illustrates some of our infrastructure investments and operating costs and how those align with customers. And so this is kind of maybe a visual image to keep in mind as we walk through the cost of service analysis. So if you look at the endpoint of the residential customer, we would have a meter and service drop, kind of dedicated customer specific infrastructure and facilities. If you go further up the chain and we get to transformer and feeder and substation investments, those are going to be more broadly distributed, and they're investments that are going to be not really customer specific, but more designed based on specific criteria related to the demands of the investments. So kind of a peak allocated type of investment in infrastructure. And then as you get farther back to kind of power plant or long-term power contracts and transmission to get power to the system, those are more energy related investments. So next slide, please. So here's an image related to water system overview as well. And here we have a similar principles at play. Individual customers will have dedicated infrastructure and investments. We'll also have some per kind of volumetric based investments related to stuff, items such as pumping equipment to pump to Hayden Bridge or chemicals for treatment that'll be allocated on a volumetric basis, as well as having peak, kind of meeting peak day demand investments, such as like reservoirs or those kind of storage infrastructure. Next slide, please. So here kind of a, probably any cost of service analysis or presentation tends to reference the concept of the different cost buckets. So we start at the top with the revenue requirement, which for each, the water and electric utility is going to be the big kind of bucket of the company's budget. That gets broken down, or as we refer to it, functionalized into production, transmission, and distribution and customer costs and shared costs. Those are further classified by demand, whether they're investments to meet peak demand or the kind of commodity, be it water or electricity for the respective utilities, the variable expenses, and then the customer specific expenses. So those are allocated to the different customer classes at the end of the cost of service modeling. So with that, we'll jump a little bit more on next slide, please. Jump a little bit more into the weeds of kind of the structure of the cost of service model. So here's kind of a high level overview. You look at the left, there's for specific categories. And so our budget and our expenses are categorized by FERC account. We have planned account, which is for investment in assets that we own at the end of the day. And then we have expense accounts that are ongoing kind of operation and maintenance expenses. Those FERCs are defined and correlate with specific mapping to these different functions, the production, transmission, distribution. So that mapping occurs in the cost of service model to put them into those specific buckets. Once we get to the classification stage, we have recently been working with a consultant we engaged that works with other utilities on this cost of service analysis, but we look at each specific cost type and determine what the best means of allocating those costs to the different customer class. So there can be production FERCs that are allocated on a volumetric basis for kilowatt hour purchases, or they can be allocated on a peak basis based on meeting the peak demand. Transmission similarly can be allocated in some cases on volumetric, in some cases on peak demand. And distribution is allocated on both demand, volumetric, or customer specific basis. And we also look at locational differentiation in the case of things such as the elevation charges for water customers, or the tree trimming type costs, or meter reading for electric customers. So different locations can have a different cost basis as well. So here's kind of an overview. We thought it might be helpful to look at some specific examples. So the next slide is kind of the same structure, but just looking at some more examples to hopefully resonate. So the first one, chlorine costs, has allocated to a specific FERC account. The function is the production, and so that mapping occurs automatically, and that's going to the water utility to that production function. It's classified as a per kgal allocation method, so we allocate it to each of the customer classes based on their kgal consumption, and then as we move kind of into the rate design discussions, that kind of ideal rate design for that would be recovering it from customers in a per kgal charge. So the energy purchase power agreement, the second example, has a similar type of allocation and classification for the electric utility. Transmission wheeling just has a peak instead of a energy basis for allocating costs, but similar structure. An item that we've discussed in the past, the contribution in lieu of tax, that's collected and remitted to the city on a revenue basis. So every dollar collected by Eweb, a percentage of that is remitted to the city for a contribution in lieu of tax. So that's the basis we allocate those costs to the different customer classes and ultimately collect from customers. The storage, reservoir maintenance, and tree trimming are examples of those location-based distribution charges, and then meters would be an example of individual customer type cost. So next slide. So now we move into kind of a simplified example of the allocation factors. So you can see this is for the electric utility. The next slide will be one for the water utility. But when we look at the different allocation factors, you can see residential, commercial, and industrial customer classes listed on the left. Each class's contribution to our coincident peak, or kind of Eweb's peak, is listed there. There's also their non-coincident peak, so each individual class's peak demand, and then the megawatt hours that we sell to customers, and then the customer count. So these are different factors. The cost of service model has quite a few more factors that are used to allocate costs, but here's kind of an example of them. If you go down to the bottom, you can see, looking at the residential customer class, just a different percentage they represent for each of those different cost types. So customer specific costs such as meter reading is going to be much higher allocation to residential customers, since that's where the majority of the meter count is, versus per megawatt hours based on their actual consumption of energy. So next slide, please. So the water uses a similar example. They have a peak day demand factor in the cost of service. Consumption is gallons sold to end use customers, as well as customer counts. So those different percentages for each of those factors. And those get allocated based on how those individual FERC accounts are classified and functionalized through the cost of service model. So next slide, please. So one change that we're proposing this year is looking at the multi-year cost of service analysis. So we're still finalizing the 2022 budget and the 2023 and 2024 year projections in the cost of service model, but here's kind of a preliminary look for illustrative purposes of the results. So you can see what we would normally see in the financial plan would be kind of the top of those lines, which would be an overall revenue requirement increase. And here's some of the big kind of buckets of costs represented, and you can see, you know, the different cost categories either going up or down slightly year over year to give us kind of a trend in where they'll be at the end of the 3 years. So the cost of service model has, you know, each of the individual perks listed, and this is kind of a roll up high level overview of that. You can go to the next slide. There's a water version as well. And you can see, looking at both of these roll-ups from the water and electric utility and the projections, that overall the general makeup of costs doesn't shift dramatically year over year, and we've seen pretty consistent trends. But as we make significant infrastructure investments or have changes in the costs throughout the organization, those can shift over time. So it's something we try to track in our cost of service analysis every year. And extending to the multi-year gives us a little bit more stability in that. So next slide, please. So hopefully this is a slide that helps kind of bring it together. So there's a bit of information on it, so I'll walk through it a little bit. But the 2022, the 3 bars in the middle represent the information for the electric utility on the prior slide. This is scaled to kind of a typical electric customer bill of, I think, $800 or $900 per kilowatt hour, or 800 or 900 kilowatt hours per month. And so you can see the kind of cost shifting over time, and the factors that contribute to kind of that average monthly bill of a little over $100 a month. So you can see, if you look at 2022, we've highlighted kind of the fixed versus variable costs, components of those. And looking on the very left is our current rates, which are a little over $20 per month basic charge. We recover our delivery costs, which are allocated generally on a demand basis, but we recover them in a per kilowatt hour basis. And then we recover energy charges also on a volumetric basis. So when we look at these kind of fixed versus variable, you can see collecting roughly $20 a month in fixed charges and having roughly $40 a month in these fixed costs. If you look at the chart to the right, it's kind of projecting out an end state and converting the cost allocation factors to different billing determinants. So just kind of looking at a fixed versus variable costs and kind of demand or kind of on off-peak energy costs to kind of get a highlight into potential future end state. So alignment, kind of working towards better alignment of our costs and our rates and prices will facilitate customer choice, potentially by allowing and potentially allow for development of products and services. This is because we're protecting the choices of one customer from impacting another customer. If we move towards higher fixed costs recovery, for example, then if one customer makes an investment in solar or conservation, then there's not a bundle of fixed costs that are left to be recovered by other customers. So this does impact the payback of those investments, and can impact, you know, how long it takes for someone to get paid back for making a conservation or solar investment. But that's kind of a driver behind the gradualism approach, looking out 3 years and kind of gradually easing into a new rate design over time. And additionally, one thing that's different examples of areas with high solar investment by different utilities are moving towards things such as residential demand charge. So I think looking at the cost of service analysis provides some insight into the different cost structure and different ways of recovering those costs from our different customer classes. So the next slide. So some next steps in the process are we still will be working towards finalizing the 2022 budget, which sets the overall revenue requirement for both water and electric utilities. We're also will be updating those results and projections into the cost of service analysis for both utilities and bringing that back to the board in November, December for those board meetings. So just kind of with those next steps in mind, if there's any questions or feedback, I'd be happy to hear that.
All right. I see Commissioner Carl's hand up.
Okay, one quick question. I think it's quick. When you do the cost of service analysis, do you start with the end in mind and then break it out into all of these different categories and customer classes? Or do you start with the costs and allocate and then see if that actually comes close to how much we're paying? I'm just curious how that breaks down.
Okay, well, so the order of the process actually works towards we project out the revenue at current rates for each class, because there's some of the inputs into the revenue forecast, such as like per kilowatt hour sales and customer count, flow into the cost allocation. So we can work on the revenue at current rates from each of the classes, kind of independent of any other organizational process. We need to have the budget and the projections for 2022 through 2024 completed before we can move into that cost phase. So that's kind of something in terms of our organizational timeline as we do budgeting over the summer. So the last it was maybe a week or two ago, the budget closed for everyone to input what their projections are. And then we just kind of go through and reconcile and make sure we have opportunity to explain any differences from like the last financial plan that the board saw. So we're kind of tying stuff back to July now and going through that process and making sure everything was budgeted the way that we thought it was going to be inaccurately. So that's kind of where we are in the process right now, just kind of making sure budget completed by the organization ties to what we thought it was going to, and making sure we can answer for any changes. Is that answer your question?
Could I inject one thing a little bit? I think so. This is one area, Commissioner Carlson, where I think there's likely going to be some evolution. We do start, as Adam mentioned, with an initial baseline, which is what is our current sort of state of pricing, and we use that as at a high level to come up with long-term financial plan impacts, revenue requirements. What are we going to have to recover in rates, for example, sort of generally? So you start and then you iterate a little bit after that. But where I think we'd like to go moving forward is, and Adam didn't mention this, we have literally hundreds of account codes. We have lots of precision to our costs. It's a matter of how do we interpret and allocate those costs. Some of them are really easy, as Adam mentioned, some of those really good examples. The amount of chlorine is definitely tied to how much water you produce. So that's a really easy volumetric alignment. Some of the other ones, just take a pipe, for example. A pipe in the ground, some of that cost is whether you use 1 gallon or 10,000 gallons. But the pipe is sized based on your peak need. So there's a peak aspect to it, there's a fixed aspect to it, and then it's used to deliver some volumetric portion. So there's a little bit of a interpretation that takes place, how much of that pipe cost is in the various categories. So I do think going forward, looking at the cost of service analysis is, I think, incredibly important strategically, because at some point we're going to have products and services, whether those are conservation related, demand response related, distributed energy related, all of those things, all those products and services need to be equitable and cost neutral to your neighbors. If you make one choice, you don't want your neighbor paying for it, or at least most people don't want their neighbor paying for their particular choice. So having a really good alignment between cost and price will become more important as we get into more and more kind of volatile and unpredictable resources and other things. So it really is important strategically that we eventually get a really good alignment between cost and price.
Okay. No, I'm not sure either of those technically answer my question, but maybe I can dig in with you at a later date. Like, it's more a matter of, you know, if you have the full cost projected of what it's going to cost to run the utility based on the various projections, do you take that and then kind of work backwards to get how much each group gets? Or do you look at what we project that we're going to serve and you have all of those different accounts codes kind of dialed in and estimate what it will be to kind of, you know, cover the costs, and then you kind of tweak it to say, okay, are we close to the final projections? And that's where you get those adjustments. Because to me, there's kind of a difference in nuance about how dialed in you are if you do it from this side versus how you do it from this side. But anyway, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Commissioner Borowski.
Thank you. I have a question. You mentioned that the fixed costs on items such as solar and efficiencies would drive the price for those if a customer chose to weatherize or chose to install solar, the fixed
Did he freeze or did I freeze?
I think you might have frozen.
All right, well, Commissioner Borowski, if you can hear us, which I don't think you can, you're frozen. Are you back?
I don't know. Am I back?
Yes, you're back.
Okay. What I was trying to get to is on things like solar and efficiencies, if the fixed cost is higher for somebody who chooses to add solar or get efficiencies, you mentioned that their payback would be longer. For me, I think that this may be an area where it is a policy decision, whether we want to incentivize those by spreading those savings that those people are going to be making over the whole customer class. And the reason I say that is if we can reduce our energy that we need to purchase by incentivizing the solar and the weatherizations and those types of things, wouldn't that offset by the amount of power we have to purchase cover the difference in the fixed costs that are being put along the way? Just, I'm not sure how that works.
Well, I can give a shot at, or take a shot at trying to answer, because I think there is probably different philosophical approaches to it. I think the point I was trying to make, I guess, was that for the cost, not for the customer installing the solar or the conservation, but someone installs solar, the system's still built to deliver power to their house. So paying those kind of like fixed infrastructure costs through a basic, kind of a fixed monthly charge or a demand charge, where those investments the utility makes to maintain the ability to serve them is recovered by that customer. If we, the way that we have a net metering in place, if they're able to net their full usage, then those costs are spread to other customers. I guess then you get into the philosophical discussion about the best way. If there's a desire to subsidize solar, is the best mechanism through a rate design that spreads the costs around in this way, or through like a direct incentive to, collect the money from customers, whoever owes the money, and then use some of that to provide some kind of an incentive or some kind of subsidy that you kind of have a little bit more control about adding the right amount you want in the investments you make instead of it being kind of buried in the rate design. So I think it's just to provide transparency would be the goal I was trying to articulate.
Frank.
Yes, Commissioner Borowski. So first of all, a lot of what you're getting toward is a policy decision. And some of this gets to the point of how do you want your pricing to reflect the strategic direction that the organization wants to go. Now, I will point out that this is a cost of service analysis, not a benefit of service service analysis. So we don't actually look at the benefits from a customer perspective. And some, one of the examples of that is the silt that is collected across our entire customer base. We capture that as a cost and put it into the cost model. It doesn't, that's independent of the benefit. So it is absolutely what you describe as a policy decision. I will say in the example that was mentioned, absolutely, if a customer puts in solar and we save the kilowatt hour expense that is offset by that solar, then that would be a natural benefit for that customer, and it's a cost savings to everybody else. But if in those volumetric rates, we also are recouping fixed charges, then by saving that volumetric charge, someone else has to pick up those fixed attributes that are covered in that volumetric cost. And that's where the misalignment is today. If a customer, and that's part of the reason why in our solar program, we for those who generate an offset, there's a net metering aspect, but we do it monthly because there's a fixed component to the cost that they are incurring. So those are absolutely policy decisions that we want to get to in the next few years. When it comes to conservation, when it comes to pricing and how pricing is and rates are formulated, and what kinds of things we might intentionally want to incentivize, that can be handled as an incentive and not necessarily as a rate benefit. So and then those become very conscious choices. The board can make those. I don't know if that helped or not.
Yeah. And then one other question that I had is, as far as the water side, now that we're going to smart meters on the water, is there a way to have lower non-peak rates for water? I know it's very easy to figure that out for electricity because we're having to buy electricity at peak prices per, let's say, but water is kind of a fixed cost. Is there a place down the road where if I water my lawn at 3 in the morning, I will have less cost than if I water it at 3 in the afternoon? And is that someplace that we can get to with the smart water meters?
Yeah, I think that's a good question and something that would be worth looking into. I think it probably, from my perspective, might be a little bit down the road, just figuring out how we quantify those costs and then cost savings, because it probably would be a longer term benefit. Since, as you mentioned, those are kind of like longer term investments. But if there was a cost differential for the on-peak usage, it might be something to consider, but I guess we get into the implementation and is the cost and administrative burden of implementing it sufficient to justify that? So that would be kind of the trade-offs maybe.
I would add to that, this is General Manager Lawson again. For those listening, I got it learned from the testimony earlier. Commissioner Borowski, in the near term, we are probably more capacity constrained, or the costs on the electric side are more dictated by capacity directly than they are on the water side. I think in the long term, as you start to get constraints with capacity over time on the water system, you'll find some of the same benefits start to occur. And some of those benefits would be, you know, how much storage do you need, for example? How much pumping do you need to do? Can you do this? Can you operate at a time when resources are more constrained or less constrained? So I think on the water side that will occur and in a little bit longer time frame than it does on the electric side, where you definitely see some time of use or capacity related costs that sort of jump up and are a pretty significant part of the cost base right now. And those are going to get probably become a larger part of the cost base over the next 5 to 10 years. So it is relevant on the water side, but probably a little different time frame.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and jump in, and with the the risk of embarrassing myself, I'm just going to say that I'm going to maybe request a little bit more in depth on this topic one-on-one or something, because there's some things that I'm just a little bit confused about, and I want to make sure that I fully understand it, because I know that we're going to be voting eventually. I think one of my questions is, if it really is like a policy or a strategic decision that we're making, for me, like strategy wise, I want to see us encouraging as many people as possible to invest in solar or alternative energy, or take advantage of weatherization programs, so that we can reduce our energy use or find alternate sources of energy, reduce our carbon footprint. And I'm just afraid if we go this route, are we disincentivizing that because it's kind of every person for his or herself, versus looking at the system more holistically? Like, I don't mind subsidizing somebody else's solar or somebody else's weatherization, because as a society that benefits everybody. Although if you're looking at it at a cost basis, maybe not so much. So it's kind of like maybe a worldview. Am I off base in thinking that that's a question? I just want to make sure that I'm clear.
Yeah, President Schlossberg. Oh, go ahead, Adam.
Oh, no, it's fine.
I was going to say, part of what you described is the reason why we view this as a policy or directional decision that the board eventually weighs in on. If it's an issue of mapping a cost to a number on a bill, we can figure that out. You know, with the hundreds of different codes, we can figure out where it's going to land. I think the challenge is what you just mentioned about you're willing to pay for somebody else's solar. I'm you know, that needs, to me, that's a board policy decision. You know, at what point do we incentivize people through something that's socialized across all of the customer base? And how is that done? Those are policy-based decisions to me. I don't want staff or us sort of unilaterally saying, oh, this is what we think we should do. What we can do is provide the board with, here's the implications of being and adhering to all of those principles, because one of the principles is equity. So if you have something that's equitable across the customer base, does that mean that someone decides to put in solar, so we are, as a neighbor, going to pay for that beyond the benefits that occur if you look at the financial piece? And maybe that's fine. Maybe there are environmental attributes that the board feels like is important. Therefore, that becomes a policy decision to me. So you're absolutely right. You're not missing anything. There are implications to how you do your pricing. It's probably in most organizations, you know, if you're running your own business from a large company to a small, how you price your product is pretty important to how it's perceived and how successful it is and all that. This particular step, the COSA step, is we need to be as precise and accurate as possible so that if the board decides to place something as a priority, going forward, that the implications of that are well understood. And we then bounce that off the principals. So it's you're not missing anything. This is why this becomes very tricky.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner McCray.
Thanks for the presentation and the memo to help us get up to speed on this. Much appreciated. If you end up doing a tutorial with Mindy, I would like to join. I definitely need some more time with this material in order to understand it more fully. I do have a couple things that for like the next iteration would be useful to me as we start talking about where policy decisions are to be made. Understanding which particular variables or levers we might be addressing that would influence customer behavior is going to be important, and then which have the greatest sensitivity. Which ones can you turn, it doesn't do anything, but which ones do we have to be really careful about how we adjust those. That would be useful to know as we kind of continue down the path of detail in this conversation. Also, I was introduced to this topic of COSA when we were upriver in Leeburg for a meeting several months ago, and people were talking about differential pricing for that rural community and the customers there compared to here. I recognize that's not what we're compared to here in Eugene Springfield. I recognize that's not the conversation we're having today, but we're laying the groundwork, I assume, for that conversation in the future. And so I want to clarify that I'm not missing something. We're not yet talking about differential pricing for different geographies, correct?
We are not in this conversation, Commissioner McCray.
Great, thanks. And as we get into those conversations, particularly that one, because I thought some about it, the different geographies, but also, as we're talking about investments in energy efficiency or renewable, localized renewable rooftop solar, what have you, to me, it'd be super valuable to have some level of a triple bottom line assessment that helps us kind of see all of the implications to the best of our ability. And to the extent that it's easy to get a third party to help us with those TBLs, I think it helps lend credibility and take some of the weight off of staff doing those TBLs. But I think that would be a valuable thing for us to have accompany this kind of analysis as we go forward. And lastly, will the variables and some form of this calculator be available to the public to see? I'm curious how transparent the COSA calculations are or will be as we carry on. That's all I have. Thanks.
I'll defer to Adam. So Adam and Deborah, given I don't run the model myself personally, I don't know how the best way and what the most transparent way to communicate what you describe as the variables, or I'll describe as the inputs, and sort of the range of the inputs and how those get captured. We're certainly willing to be as transparent as we can without, hopefully confusing people. It's a complicated thing. So I guess I'll ask Adam or Deborah to elaborate a little bit on that piece of it.
Yeah, because we've presented in the past really high-level summaries. So I think if the request or the desire for a greater granularity, it's something that we could put together something that provides more level of detail. And even if you mentioned the kind of working group session, we can kind of get a feel for that if you did want to see some of the summary, because it does end up I can see publishing the thing might get a little bit confusing just to follow and just figuring out how to format in a way that is easily distributed. But
Adam,
yeah.
would there be a way to, within the different functions, functions being production, transmission, and distribution, a way to capture I'll say the 10 largest inputs to each of those areas and kind of what feeds into, so you know, kind of the 80-20 rule. I mean, you don't, given that there's hundreds of accounts, there's a lot of things that you could increase 200% and it wouldn't make a dent in it. But maybe we could look at something that would kind of scale this, that we could discuss for both water and electric, because those are different. What are some of the key drivers within each of those areas? And then where do they land from a commodity capacity or demand, and then customer piece, and just kind of work on a map. I mean, we can, maybe Deborah, you and I can brainstorm a little bit on that, but I think that would probably be helpful.
I think we also have an opportunity anywhere that we see cost shifting to call out and provide further explanation in those areas, and anywhere where we've seen questions from the public for sure. So yes, Frank, let's talk a little bit more and see what we can come up with for October. And then the actual model itself is available through a public records request, but it is probably not all that useful for the average consumer. And so certainly finding a way to be more proactive and giving people the kind of information that would be useful to them upfront at that the November meeting would be our best course.
Yeah.
That approach all sounds right. I appreciate your proposal there, Frank. Also, you know, any major assumptions that we're making that are kind of baked into the cake would be useful to have made super clear. Anyway, thank you both.
Yeah, thank you, Deborah. Is it, and Adam, is it fair to say that while we're going through this, we're looking at a multi-year COSA, we're talking about the middle function between revenue requirement and rate making. We're not actually proposing significant rate redesign at this point. That's the policy discussions that we're probably going to have next, but understanding the middle piece, which is the COSA, is a part of that rate design, which is, I think I had tapped for 2022 to work with the board on and about a whole new rate design approach, but this is a foundational piece to that. We're not talking about changing rate design this year.
This is really the underpinnings of it all, or the foundation for sure. And I'm hopeful that you'll invite us back for a similar conversation around the basics of rate design to start that 2022 conversation.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I just wanted to make that clear.
All right, Commissioner Brown.
Thank you. A comment and then a question. A comment just for those of you that are going to get more up to speed on what's going on. I know it's a daunting task to understand this, but we went through rate design and changing the fixed rate maybe 10, 15 years ago, and there was a lot of input and a lot of discussion about it. We used to have tiered rates on consumption. The first amount was a certain rate, and the more you consumed, the more you paid. And it was regressive. And then we had a discussion about the equitability, because if you're doing things like changing the base rate and you're subsidizing solar, well, 50% of the housing stock is rentals, and they tend to be the entities that would have to support that. And there was kind of an equity discussion. So there's a history behind having this discussion before on rate design. So you may want to make sure that that's brought into your discussion. So Adam, thank you for the presentation. A real quick question. You mentioned that if the utility has major cost changes or shifts during this period, that can affect the COSA significantly, or it can. Is that did I hear you correctly?
Yeah, and I guess when I was saying that, I was thinking about once we start looking at like the second source, I'd imagine a 3-year trajectory that has all this, second source investments in it probably will look different than the scale of the buckets here, where they all look pretty similar, and that type of thing.
I'm thinking not only second source, but Lieberg. I think we've got a couple huge things that could potentially do that. And if it's premature to ask about how that's going to affect this, if this is a 5 to 10 year projection, that's one thing. But I think reality is that we're going to realize both of those entities in the next, not outside of a 10-year window. And so I was wondering how we may, do we just wait till it happens and then go into it, or kind of like Commissioner Carlson mentioned earlier about we get the cost and then we back into it, or how will we deal with those two major things?
Well, I think the approach that I would see at least would be starting now, since we're looking probably at a 3-year trajectory that doesn't include those investments. It'll give us an opportunity both kind of internally to see how effectively we're tracking with kind of a longer term, more detailed view, where in the past we've always been doing the 10-year plan, but this is a little bit more granular. And then also having these dialogues with internally and with the board in terms of looking at how these cost shifting occurs over time, and how well it tracks and how it impacts. Because I think if the next iteration of a 3-year cost of service had results that were impacting significant investments that were causing costs to shift, then we'd probably be having a different discussion around gradualism and rate design for that trajectory than one that's relatively stable. I think if the costs are pretty similar every year, then probably next year's is a good step towards, or the following year's COSTA is probably a good step towards where our costs will be in a few years. But if they are shifting, I think this multi-year view hopefully provides some information to inform the board to make those decisions.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Brown, I would add to what Adam just said, and there's kind of two pieces to this. One is for fiscal planning, you want to have and put in high-level estimates and forecasts for the large lumps in the oatmeal as you describe them, and kind of understand their impact going forward on the revenue requirement, and to a certain extent how they filter through in a potential change in a cost of service analysis, and then eventually pricing. So there's a planning piece to this, but there's also the reality of the projects that we look at them. There is a difference between capital and expensed items. So O&M and capital are, and in many ways, a smaller blip in capital gets dampened over a period of time naturally, because as you recover those costs. And so depending on where those costs fall, the second source will certainly be significant relative to the size of the budget. The Lieberg one, depending on the path, may or may not be overly influential on the COSA itself. It might still be in production. It might still be in some of the same recovery categories. So it may or may not impact the allocation of costs, although it is a large expense.
Thank you.
All right. Are there any further questions or comments from commissioners? Don't see any. Deborah and Adam, did you get what you needed from us?
I think I did. Thank you very much. And then I'll just look to hear maybe from Holly or Ann if there is an interest in doing a smaller further introduction to COSA, like our budget introduction and our PERS introduction that we've done for new board members in the past.
Great, thank you very much for that. All right, so we are about 20 minutes ahead of schedule. So I'm wondering if people want to have our 5-minute break now, or I don't even know if Carl's here for his presentation. If we wanted to push ahead, I guess I should have asked that first.
Ms. Lutzberg, I am here and ready to present if you all want me to present.
All right, so maybe commissioners, just a show of hands, if you want to have our 5-minute break now, raise your hand. Okay, so then nobody raised their hand, so it seems like we want to push on through, and we will do our 5-minute break after the Mackenzie Watershed Recovery and Restoration Plan. So we will move on to agenda item number 9, and Carl, you are up.
Thank you, President Schlossberg and commissioners. Yes, it is fitting on this 1-year anniversary that we're talking about our recovery and restoration efforts in the McKenzie to protect and restore our sole source of drinking water. My name is, for the record, Carl Morgenstern. I'm the Watershed Restoration Program Manager and leading the recovery effort as part of the task force. Next slide, please. So tonight I was basically going to spend a little bit of time kind of wrapping up the emergency response phase, kind of putting a bow on it, and moving on to the next phase of work, which is longer term watershed restoration. So kind of bringing you up to speed on that and updating you where we are with the work done to date in 2021. And then really shifting towards looking at the 2022 budget and the work that we're hoping to get done in 2022 and lay that out for you so that we can get direction and information back from you as to if we're heading in the right direction or not. And then wanted to kind of tee up a discussion on the opportunities that we have to scale work up versus the need to be cognizant of using customer money and look at balancing those in the future. I don't think obviously today we need to worry about that, but just wanted to kind of throw that out there to start thinking about that. Next slide, please. So this is just kind of a refresher. We are still operating and working under the this recovery task force organization. And so there are 6 teams that are, and I think we like this organization and structure because it helps us get everything we need done and coordinate the work in very manageable bite-sized chunks. But the point of this slide is really, given where we are today, I just want to first off, just reiterate that these teams, each of these teams play a key function and are made up of multi-agency organizations. So it's not just Eweb. So we have Lane County Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, a host of organizations and agencies working under these teams together. But I particularly wanted to pay special recognition to the core Pure Water Partners team members that have really done the heavy lifting and has frankly worked their butts off over this last year to get some great work done on the ground, and really are in need of some rest, to be honest. And that is the McKenzie Watershed Council, the Upper Willamette Soil and Water Conservation District, and the McKenzie River Trust. They have been the essentially the heroes of this effort in my mind. Next slide, please. So to kind of remind you of where we've been since the fire, the board, as you recall, back in October, approved the initial $1 million investment in kind of this emergency response phase of work, and really trying to address some of those immediate threats that we faced right after the fire erupted, and when we finally got access to the watershed to start doing work in the watershed. And so, as you recall, we had toxic ash, debris, houses burned along the river that were ready to just dump stuff into the river with the coming rains. And so there was very much a race against rain to make some stuff happen on the ground. And we did, I think, a pretty admirable job of trying to stabilize at least the high priority areas that we could get into to stabilize in partnership with the Environmental Protection Agency. And one of the things to kind of point out and remember is that, I know you've heard the story of using our Pure Water Partners program infrastructure to pivot from doing riparian health assessments and working with landowners on protecting healthy riparian forests to doing burn assessments and designing erosion control, and that worked well for us. One of the other things that you have to keep in mind as we do this work, because it is on private property, and so we need to have the property owners access agreement. We need their permission to do any work on their property. We need their support. And so one of the other things that the Pure Water Partners program provided us was that we already had 90 landowners in the pipeline of that program when the fire occurred. So it allowed us to work on those landowners' properties that we already had access under the old Pure Water Partners program quickly, and why we tried to track down folks that were displaced by the fire to try and to get access agreements from them. So that was, upfront a big part of work that really determined how quickly we could move. So I just wanted to remind the board of that. I'm not going to go through these stats. You've seen these before, but a lot of work was done in a quick amount of time. And once again, just hats off to the Watershed Council, the Saltwater Conservation District, and McKenzie River Trust, and others, Lane Council of Governments and others that really helped efficiently get this work on the ground as quick as we could. So this work wrapped up in April, and now we're moving into the next phase of work, which, next slide, please, Holly. So this phase of work, and this title doesn't really, may mislead you that we're already done with this work. I just realized that as I look at the slides, we're not done with this work, even though it says August 2021. It's just, you know, that's up to this, the stats that you see on here are up to August, but this work is going to be ongoing for the next 3-4 years or more. But this work is really transitioning to increasing the amount of work and scaling up that work and doing more of what needs to be done on the ground to make us in a better position to restore the watershed. And so one of the things that we're looking at is really there's kind of 4 major bodies of work in this next phase of work that we're doing this year, and that is you know, continuing to take care of the plants we put in the ground, those 90 acres that were planted over the winter, to make sure as many of those survive in the drought, while we're essentially scaling and doing plans on where we do the next level of planting this coming winter. And if you remember, we had 210,000 plants that we put in the ground, native plants, in last winter. We now have an order that is over 500,000 plants that we're going to be putting in the ground this next winter. So that work is scaling up as it should, focused on riparian and floodplain areas. But the thing that really kind of tripped us up coming out of the emergency response phase was we got an ODF, accessed ODF, Oregon Department of Forestry funds, about $200,000 to do fuels work, but that money had to be spent by the end of June. And so when we came out of the emergency response phase, we immediately had to just run literally to spend money over 2 months in order to use ODF's funds to do a lot of really good work on the ground across 35 properties. So after that work was completed, we're able to kind of take a pause and literally allow folks to get some rest while we started transitioning to this next phase of work. So we are a little bit behind. We were hoping to be, but you know, you can only, you know, whip a horse so hard to get going so fast. So we need to lay off and allow the work to catch up to us. And what this really looked at was redesigning our GIS field tools that allows us to collect information on the ground and prioritize that work. And we're adding some efficiencies into that so that we can actually feed this work and assign it to contractors as we map it on the ground. And so as you see in the chart in the bottom left there, these are the landowners that are kind of in motion right now to do these assessments. And then as we do this assessments, it will inform the amount of work we do this fall and into next winter. Next slide, please. And of course, one of the main things we're doing this work for is water quality. And so I just wanted to kind of, you know, bring this back to you. And really I know these graphs are pretty small for you to see. The point is to look at the pattern, not so much the individual measurements. But I tried to take essentially surrogates of each kind of area that we expected impacts from the fire: nutrient loads, metals, bacteria, organic carbon. Those are the big ones. And basically just pull a parameter out that kind of helps look at the rest of them. So like, for example, nitrate really mirrors similar to phosphorus and other nutrients. The same with aluminum, mirrors similar to manganese and other metals. And so what you can see is the arrow is where the fire, when the fire started. And you can see in those early storms in November, December, and a little bit into January, we had some peak flushing happening as ash got washed off the landscape and so forth. And then that has dropped down into basically pre-fire levels. Except for you see E. coli did not really have, we don't really have an E. coli problem in the watershed. The fire obviously mobilized a lot of bacteria. And the other thing to point out that the blue line you see there is Gate Creek, which drains a large burned area. And then the red line is the McKenzie at Hendricks Bridge. So that's kind of the closest point we have of monitoring downstream of the fire. And so, so you can see that the trib that is draining areas actually brings a lot of more stuff to it, as it should, than what we're seeing in the river. I guess the other thing to point out is that, you know, last year, as you all know, the lack of storms really was good for water quality. It's bad for the drought we're in, but we do not expect to have that, to dodge that bullet again this winter. And so we fully anticipate more significant storms. And as a result, we do have our network of water quality stations that helps inform us real time of when things are coming unraveled and where they're coming unraveled. That helps us respond as well as help our treatment operators plan for it. So we'll continue that. The other piece is the organic compounds that we expected to see, polyaromatic hydrocarbons, semi-volatile organics, all these other things that we expect to come off the landscape. We really did not see an issue. What we did see was a lot of an uptick in the number of compounds we were seeing that are estimated, meaning that the lab couldn't really see them at the detection limits they have. And so they know something might be there, but they can't quantify it. So I call this kind of a chatter, so to speak. And so we really want to maintain monitoring of these so that if that chatter becomes something more real, where we are starting to see some of those compounds show up in the river, we want to know about it. So that is another piece that we'll definitely be monitoring for as we move forward. Next slide, please. So if you remember when presented to the board back in March, we kind of categorized the work for the watershed protection plan into three kind of buckets. The risk-based, which kind of the last three slides really alluded to. And that also includes the smart rebuilding incentives, which I think I failed to mention on the previous slide, that we are implementing with Lane County and starting to get some traction on. And then there's the resiliency, which is really the actions to help mitigate the impacts of the fire, but really set up long-term resiliency to future climate disasters. So whether it's drought, flooding, or future fires. So it not only helps us in the near term, but really increases the watershed resiliency to future events. And that's really based on the idea that we're keeping more water in the landscape and helping with that. And the third is that strategic category, where we're looking kind of at a bigger opportunity that the fire presents to do some things that help with carbon sequestration and kind of the co-benefits of watershed restoration and carbon sequestration. And you'll hear from Anna Wade in Nick's presentation a little bit about how this is being kind of thought about in our customer-facing view of things. Next slide, please. So the proposed 2022 budget for the risk-based work is $2.15 million, a little over $2 million, what we're expecting. And really, the Eweb surcharge fee really is critical to funding this work. We really can't find a lot of outside funding mechanisms for doing these kind of assessments, erosion control, monitoring, and the rebuild incentives. We do see opportunity for funding support around revegetation, invasive weeds treatment, fuels work from Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, Oregon Department of Forestry, and the Bureau of Land Management, to name a few. So the key piece of this work, as pointed out earlier, are these property assessments, which is under that PWP operations bar. And really, that is for any landowner that comes in through our portal and asks for assessment, we will do an assessment. And what that does is it starts a relationship with landowner, but then also allows us to look at the property and highlight the priority work we know or want to do, and then kind of be able to identify some of that lower priority stuff that maybe the landowner can do on their own and still help us move in a good direction. And so really our design of this risk-based work is to get landowners in to help with immediate needs while they're also struggling with rebuilding and other things. And if we can help them take care of a few things, then I think we've helped in some way and really start building that longer term trust and relationship. Next slide, please. And so the resiliency work is a little bit more complex in that there's really three kind of categories of that work. One is these floodway acquisitions that we're doing with the McKenzie River Trust to basically help landowners that are really don't want to rebuild, want to move on, but see an opportunity to give towards conservation, to be able to acquire those floodway properties, remove that infrastructure of the burned home, the septic systems, the driveways, and then restore that area. And then the other two areas are really into restoring large-scale floodplains, and then in the tributary systems themselves, being able to set up large wood placement that acts as what we're calling kind of catcher mitts to sediment and trying to slow down flows and treat things that are coming at us. And there's a significant outside investment, as you can see, from outside sources for this work. I think this is what a lot of people see as quote unquote green infrastructure. And so I think we are attracting some good outside investments that will make this happen. And really, we're in kind of a short-term window here where we know that in the next 2 to 4 years, a lot of the opportunities we're seeing today will not exist. So we see this work as nearly $2 million in next year's budget. And a lot of the majority of that is going towards acquisitions, with the rest of it kind of helping feed the restoration work that others are paying for. Next slide, please. So this is just an example. I know, on October 22nd, if we're still doing this, given COVID, we do plan a tour with the board to look at Fenrock Reach project and the Deer Creek project that did very similar to what you're seeing here. And this is South Fork, McKenzie in the lower part, where you can see in the pre-project, you have that incised river channel. And then what the work does is essentially divert the river while we're doing work in the floodplain. And we take the berms and stuff that the materials that keeping the river incised, and then we fill in the incised channel and then reintroduce the river back onto its floodplain and let it pick where it wants to go. You see a lot of large wood there. That wood, because the velocities are knocked down so much, there was a lot of concern about high velocity flows sending that wood downstream, and we have not seen that happen even up to 5,000 CFS. So the wood is fairly stable and it's designed to kind of maintain that stability over time. But as you can see, it spreads that flow across the landscape, slows it down, drops out sediment, and provides excellent habitat for fish and avian and amphibian species. Next slide, please. So this is a map showing, I know it's kind of crude. I was trying to come up with something fancy, but this is the best I could do. As you should, yeah, I had crayons, but then I graduated to this. But so the red projects and those ovals are the floodplain restoration projects. That one in the middle there between of the three is Fenrock Reach. Then the one to the right is lower South Fork of the Delta campground area. And then the other one is Quartz Creek. So these three, the Fenrock Reach is done and the other two are in planning design phase. And then you see those little, what I refer to them as catcher mitts, but I've heard them, Karen Kelly looked at them and said, those look like eyebrows or eyelashes. But anyway, those are what we're calling, those are large wood projects and tributaries that typically don't have floodplains and are higher gradient systems. And so putting in large wood that actually slows down flows and drops out sediment are what those symbols represent. And so you can see the three red ones we've completed one and two are under design right now. Then the black ones are areas that we can see opportunity and are already working towards that opportunity to do future projects in the near future. And basically the idea is one of our grant requests to FEMA is to help us pay for the design and permitting of these future opportunities as well. And so one thing that if we are successful beyond all belief and are able to actually do all these projects, and if I drew a kind of a shading upstream of each of those projects as to what the drainage area of these projects collected from and treated for, basically 70% of over 70% of the burned area would be pre-treated before hitting the river. And so that's the level of success we have opportunity to achieve. Whether we get there or not, obviously it depends on landowners, it depends on funding and many other things, but we feel like we are in a good position to make a lot of this work happen. Next slide, please. So finally, the strategic actions is really looking at that intersection between some of the work we're doing in the watershed restoration and the opportunity to provide carbon sequestration benefits. And so we're working with the University of Oregon on a lot of the research that is kind of building the knowledge and design that we'll use that will help influence future project design. But really they're focused on these depositional environments that we're creating from these floodplain areas where we have essentially are able to sequester carbon in a way that secures it from future fires, for example, so we don't release what carbon we've achieved from future climate change disasters. And these future projects, and a lot of the research being done is on this High Banks Road property, which someday we'll be able to bring you out there and you can see. And then we're also kind of leaning into U of O is doing some baseline carbon measurements on the floodplain project areas before we actually do projects, and we'll measure post-project and compare that to control areas to show the carbon, the benefits of those projects for carbon sequestration. But really, this is all kind of a, you know, the strategic is really looking at what is the potential here. And as we start developing these projects and getting a little bit more meat on them, we'll bring them back for board discussion. And, you know, there'll be other sources of funding if we decide to move in these directions. So this is not part of the surcharge. Next slide, please. And so basically to summarize this whole budget request is we're looking at the total budget next year of 4.275 million to do all this work. And it's pretty neatly split between risk-based and resiliency projects. We are, you know, we are pursuing and have been successful and will continue to pursue outside funding, which brings up that question, which in our minds by 2023, we should have a pretty good picture to then have a good conversation with the board around how do we use this increase in outside funding? Do we scale up what we're doing, or do we start reducing our customers' obligations in that sense? So I think that's a future discussion, but I wanted to kind of start painting it out here so that we can start thinking about it as we understand better what outside investments we're attracting. Next slide, please. So with that, I will leave it for questions. And there's kind of three areas looking at, you know, kind of our overall approach to restoration and recovery. Any feedback on what we're missing, questions on how we're doing it, and then our budget proposal and direction on that. And then this kind of balancing of outside investments versus Eweb surcharge. Any thoughts on that or anything else you have? So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. I see Sonia eagerly raising her hand. So Commissioner Carlson.
I'm also willing to hold if others have. I wrote my questions down, so they're at the ready. One, I'm curious, the plants that were planted last fall that we kind of all saw out there, did they survive the immense heat, or as part of the, I think you said something like 500,000 plants that are coming in, is that part of a replacement to deal with some that didn't make it?
Yeah, well, first off, when we design the revegetation efforts, they're built in. A certain mortality is built into that design.
Sure.
So we overplant knowing that there will be mortality, but the drought has caused an increase in mortality, and we've tried to mitigate that through some of our plant maintenance activities, and we've been successful in at least heading off some of the worst. But yes, so of those 500,000 plants, a certain percentage of those will go into in-planting the areas that need kind of some help this winter.
Okay.
And we don't know what that looks like yet until we finish our assessments, but we'll have a pretty clear picture in a couple months how that is all playing out.
Okay, all right, fair enough. Floodplains, they seem effective at reducing the sediment. I'm curious, does that work? Does it raise the temperature of the water, and would that in turn increase risk of cyanotoxins?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. What we're seeing in the research, especially on South Fork, which is the oldest projects that have been done and is starting to really ramp up monitoring, is that we actually see a cooling effect, because what you're doing is you're slowing down the flow and you have an increase in canopy cover, and so you have some heating happening, but the majority of that flow is flowing through gravels, cooling down, and then coming out in cold water pockets. So the overall effect is in some ways a cooling of water. It's not going to be an increase in temperature. There's also a seasonality to it as well. As far as the cyanotoxins and harmful algal blooms, it really does not, given you're resetting an ecosystem to be a lot more healthy in what it does, and harmful algal blooms and toxins tend to bloom in areas that are kind of out of balance. And so given the dynamics of the systems in the floodplain, we really don't expect to see harmful algal blooms and haven't seen them in the projects that have been completed. But that is certainly obviously something that we're going to be really focused on. It's not something we expect based on what we've seen to date, but we'll certainly keep an eye on it and monitor for it.
So you don't anticipate, I mean, just even with the burned area, would you typically see a higher rate of cyanotoxins coming off of a big burn like that, because it is a shock and now kind of a new change there outside of the floodplain question? And if so, there isn't really a way to treat cyanotoxins, correct?
No, I mean, the natural way to treat it is to increase your zooplankton populations to eat the bacteria or the algae. But yes, your point is a good one, and that's one that we are currently engaged in multi-year research with Oregon State University and the USGS on around the Terwilliger and Rebel fires. We've been monitoring to see if those are actually increasing nutrient loads to cougar, and then that leads to harmful algal blooms. That's kind of the operating theory, but we haven't seen that play out yet, just because, as you know, things are very complex based on your water year, how much rain you have, snow, and sun. Yeah, there's so many variables. But we have not seen that, but that is certainly possible. But the other piece is that, and we've seen this in South Fork and Deer Creek, where these floodplain projects act as essentially a really good fire break. And so you still have the green trees and vegetation that's uptaking those nutrients and creating shade even after a fire because they didn't burn. And so you have that benefit as well.
Excellent. Yeah, that was actually my next question. Was the floodplain just part of a kind of restoration piece, or is it actually reduce the risk of fire because the water is so much more spread out? So that's excellent. Last question I had, and then I'll have one comment. FEMA, do we have any anticipation that some of this will be reimbursed by FEMA, or was that really just kind of the early on work that was more reimbursed by FEMA? Because I know it takes a long time for FEMA to turn around.
Yeah, and I actually had a note. I forgot on the one slide that I was showing you emergency response efforts we did. Obviously, those we did apply for FEMA reimbursement. Expect 75% of that $1 million to be reimbursed. We have not seen anything saying otherwise. And then for the other FEMA projects, it's interesting because these projects obviously are new to FEMA's kind of purview, and so we're having to go through a little bit more hurdles for the applications we're going to submit this January to show that there's the benefit versus cost. And we've engaged with even folks in England who do this work, and actually it's now national policy to do these kind of floodplain restoration projects because of the flood mitigation benefits. So I think we are, at first we're like, oh boy, we have to go over this pretty high bar to show FEMA this is worth it. But now we're like, this is going to be easy in some ways. I mean, I'm being,
yeah, easy compared to what normal things are. Yeah.
We're seeing some good information and data that I think will help us make a really solid case. And so we do expect FEMA to reimburse us for a large part of this work.
Got it. Well, excellent. Thank you so much for all the efforts out there. I'm really encouraged by all of the different things that you're doing. I feel very thankful that we have the partnerships that we do in this region that you've helped build and cultivate. And because I know that this is not happening everywhere across the state. So it makes me very proud to be a little fly on the wall to help say, rah, keep going. You're doing a great job. Thanks.
Thank you.
Commissioner Borofsky.
Thank you, and thank you for the presentation and all the work that everybody's done upriver. I have two questions and then a little bit of a comment, I guess. First question, on one of the slides you showed the spike at Gate Creek. Do we have monitoring on Gate Creek?
Sorry, I missed the first part of your question. The what on Gate Creek?
Well, you showed a slide that had big spikes because of the influence of Gate Creek on the watershed, and I'm just wondering, right, do we have monitoring on Gate Creek?
Yes, as you see, those big spikes were those early storms after the fire. If you look to the right of that, the blue lines kind of go and then disappear. So we are continuing to monitor Gate Creek. In fact, there's an early warning water quality station on Gate Creek now, as well as a gauge, a USGS gauge. So we've really ramped up our visibility of what's happening on Gate Creek as a result of what we saw early. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure. I knew we had we had monitoring further upriver. I wasn't sure if we had a monitor in Gate Creek. The second thing that I wanted to speak to was I'm totally on board with the budget going forward with the two strategies that are there, the resiliency and the other one. What I want to speak to is the strategic one. When we first passed the surcharge, one of the things that I was excited about was the strategic portion of that and the opportunity to do carbon offsets. And what my thought on that was if we could acquire right-of-way or stream buffers from some of the larger timber landowners and say, give us 150 feet each side of these streams, and we will use them as carbon offsets that we can sell and keep them in, replant them and have them in perpetuity. That was something that was really exciting to me. And I don't necessarily see that in the budget. I see a small portions, for planning and those types of things, but I really see that as an opportunity that I would like to see pursued going forward. I mean, I know that the city of Eugene is purchasing carbon offsets right now out of state, right? Up in Washington. Well, can we partner with some of our local people that are buying carbon offsets to spend their money upriver? So I would like to see that explored more so, and hopefully something that we can talk about when we have our joint meeting with the city coming up later this fall, maybe a partnership to work with that. So that's something that I'm excited about and would like to see us pursue more. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think John Brown has his hand up. His camera is not quite situated.
Yeah, go for it, Commissioner.
I can't sleep if I don't do that. I'm sorry. Seriously, Carl, as you know, I've always really put you in the forefront of what you're doing, and I'm once again impressed with what you've done and the organizational skills. In 12 months, you've done this, and keep going. So a few technical questions. The court just recently ruled on the Corps of Engineers have to really substantially increase the flow of the South Fork. Is that going to A, affect your project, or B, affect the projects that have already been implemented there, because they've been doing that for 10 years?
Short answer is no. We do not anticipate increased flows impacting those projects. In fact, increased flows will help those projects by spreading out flow into more areas that we've opened up for it. So no, we do not anticipate that.
I saw you had a project scheduled for Quartz Creek, and I know historically, even before the fire, that thing has been a huge source of sediment and things up for that drainage. Did somebody acquire that riparian area down by where Quartz Creek meets right below Finrock, and so we can plant it and restore it?
So essentially, where we are in that is we're working to get a conservation easement as we speak. Actually, this week we're having a meeting to start, to continue going over the terms and conditions. So, yeah, the short answer is a conservation easement is in motion to allow us to do that work in the next year or two.
That'd be huge. Thank you. And lastly, because since you brought up the carbon project on High Banks, I just want to make sure that's not in the area that was affected by the fire. It's absolutely right above our intake, but we have some other projects there that I haven't heard anything about that were significant. And that's the 42nd Street Stormwater Outflow project that we've kind of been at odds with Oregon Fish and Wildlife about. What's the status of that? So, I mean, since you brought up High Banks, I want to bring it up because that's something that I want to make sure that doesn't fall by the wayside, that gets done, because stormwater entering the water right above our intake is something I want to pay attention to.
No, Commissioner Brown, that's a great question. And, in my new position, I am no longer managing that work. Susan Fricky is, but that is still a priority for source protection, is the urban runoff and addressing and treating urban runoff. To be honest, I am not 100% sure where they are on that. I know she is still moving forward on that work. In fact, I think on the 52nd Street We did a large planting to try and restore some of that lower area that's already kind of a wetland. And then what I think I remember her saying is that in the last visit, beavers have actually done some of the work that we were planning on doing. So it seems like it's moving in the right direction, but I can't, I'd have to connect with Susan to see where that work is.
Okay, thank you. And I know you wanted feedback on the direction of the budget. Number one, I support it, and I would give you more money if you needed it. And number two, if we can leverage our funds with other things and grants, go for it. I'm all in on what you're doing, and thank you very much for your tireless efforts, Matt. I know that's kind of your job too, but in a different venue. But thank you for what you're doing, because like I said, I'll take water, you take electricity, and we'll see who lasts the longest. It's so important, and I really appreciate everything you've done. You get my vote, so thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner McCray.
Thanks, Mindy. Got my vote too, Carl. Thanks for the presentation. Thanks for your work you're doing. I know it's been said a number of times. I'll just say really quickly, we are super blessed to have this team and the Pure Water Partners doing the work in this watershed. Other fire-affected communities do not have the same asset, and we are leaps ahead. So thanks for leading that team. And as you said, kudos to those other organizations that are doing a ton of the lifting with Eweb. A couple of questions. As we think about, you said there weren't as many pollutants as we'd expect, or as we were kind of anticipating, but with higher flows, we may see more of that. I'm curious what pollutants we are most concerned about, i.e. are most difficult to take out at the treatment plant, and how we might be targeting those specific pollutants. And as an example, I know that a common practice after clear-cut logging on large-scale industrial forest is to apply herbicide to keep the broadleaf plants from resprouting. Do we expect to see herbicide? I mean, I would assume we just expect to see herbicide applications across the watershed, and do we expect to see that show up in the water? And if so, is there anything we can do about it?
Yeah, those are excellent questions, Commissioner McCray. I appreciate that. Well, I guess the short answer, well, I'll try to start at the beginning of your question. So some of the areas that we're somewhat not nervous about, but we expect to see increases in are those things that are related to combustion and fire and destruction of, or partially combusted materials. And so those would lead us down the polyaromatic hydrocarbons and some of those semi-volatile compounds. And those are a lot of those tend to attenuate to sediment. And so they would be addressed in our treatment process through dropping out sediments, for example. There are some that, are more related to, as you pointed out, herbicide use post fire as you revegetate. And we do anticipate, given the scale and magnitude of salvage logging that has occurred, to see herbicide use go up, and are concerned about that. Some of the what I called chatter earlier, those estimated values, those trace amounts that really aren't quantified by the lab because they're so low right now. We are seeing some of those herbicide compounds in that chatter. And so we do want to, that is something that we do want to continue monitoring for. Some of those dissolved organic compounds have a harder to treat. Not that we can't. I know some of the things that that the treatment plant is doing, and Ray Leipold has been, amazing at staying one step ahead, is putting essentially like a activated carbon on top of our filter system, so that activated carbon not only removes some of those contaminants as it goes through the filter system, but also provides kind of a better habitat for the biofilter to increase the other parts that the filters take out, even cyanotoxins. So I think, I have full faith in our treatment plant that as we work, and the beauty is that we, reorganize, what is it now, 4 years? I don't remember now, but we brought water quality together with treatment up at Hayden Bridge. And so we are joined at the hip, and as we know things, they know things, and as they're seeing things, they tell us. So it's a great work environment up there, and a lot of good collaboration going on. So I have confidence that as long as we're continuing to look at these and because it's not going to be, we're not going to see an increase like overnight where it goes from, trace amounts to acute levels. We will start seeing trends pick up, and then we start taking appropriate action to address them and increase our monitoring to get better visibility of it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's helpful. Yep. Thank you. I appreciate that. I want to echo Commissioner Borowski's thoughts about buffers. I do wonder if there's an opportunity for us to work with some large-scale landowners to either purchase the land itself or purchase conservation easements along those buffers. I'm certain that the team you're working with is looking at that, and I just hope we take every opportunity we can, because it seems like that's a big, long-term, lasting investment in really addressing some of the pollutants. I'm curious what partners we have in terms of the landscape scale acquisition. I know McKinsey River Trust is a partner here in that. Are there other partners locally or statewide or nationally that we are engaging to assist with some of this acquisition?
Yes. The Forest Service is an excellent partner we're working with, who can also bring funding to these large scale acquisitions, so they can fund up to 75% of an acquisition. We're also working with the Columbia Land Trust and the World Resources Institute that also bring kind of this experience and more depth into kind of looking at the situation and helping us understand what we should be thinking and where we should be going, and funding opportunities that would help us actually acquire it without using ratepayer money. Those are a few. I'm sure I'm missing a couple.
That's great. I just was curious if we're expanding beyond our local area. It sounds like we are. I'm grateful for that. Thank you for leveraging every dollar and all of our partners to get the work done. Lastly, the question about how to use these funds. I haven't heard any complaints about the new fee. I believe it started in July, so there's not a lot of history there, but I'll certainly be listening to hear if people start to raise questions about how is this money being used, or if they're concerned about it, but I haven't heard that yet. Given that, as you know, landslide risk and erosion risk actually increases over the first several years, and we would expect to see, peak landslide risk in that watershed in 3 to 5 years out from this fire. I think, we may not, the worst is definitely not behind us in terms of water quality impacts. And so I encourage us to go full force, as heavy as we can to try and mitigate, water quality impacts, erosion potential as much as possible. And so at least for the time being, I say hang on to those dollars and reinvest them. I'm with John Brown on that one. Thanks very much for the presentation and your efforts.
Thank you.
All right, this is Commissioner Schlossberg, and last but not least, thank you, Carl. I just have a few questions for you. One really simple, what is smart rebuild?
Excellent question. I kind of glossed over that, didn't I? So we have a suite of incentives that we are rolling out for landowners who are looking to rebuild if their home that got destroyed. And a few of those are basically helping them or incentivize them to make it essentially cost neutral for them to move their house footprint away from the river, out of the floodplain, and out of the riparian area. And so the grants that we have available for that allow them to move the house and then adjust the piping from their well and their septic system as they need to accommodate that new footprint. And then we also have incentives around the septic systems to upgrade septic systems and make them better. And I think I forgot to mention on the last one, the septic piece, the legislature did provide us $1.5 million for septic upgrades and repairs and replacements. So I think any of our funds that we spend towards that will be reimbursed by the state, but that's all being worked out still as to how we can use that money and what it's for. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. So I'm curious. So it sounds like there's a lot of incentives and there's a lot of funding for these incentives. And like going forward, looking to the future, is there any talk of legislation about just learning lessons from this, like around zoning or building codes close to the rivers, not just here on the Mackenzie, but just like the lessons that we can take from this? I know it's not our job at Eweb to propose legislation, but in your talking with legislators, is there any look to doing something like that so that we're not just incentivizing landowners, but we're actually making things safer from the get-go?
Yeah, that's a tough one, because there's kind of a two sides to that sword. That, you know, there is talk about having you know, better land use laws that don't allow people to build and say the floodway, but that smacks up against private property rights that are, you know, that people are very passionate about. And so even in the wildfire recovery bill, initially there was some impetus to try to encourage folks not to rebuild where they're rebuilding a hazardous area, but that got essentially overturned with basically allowing rebuilding a footprint without any need to do any kind of mitigation for potential future hazards. So it's you know, I'm not aware of any. I know Jason might be tracking some stuff. I would obviously fully encourage that given the dynamics of climate change and what we have coming at us. But yeah, that's a tough one to get at.
All right. Well, if anything like that happens, I wholeheartedly support Eweb getting behind legislation like that, because it would certainly make things a lot easier. My other question is, I know that you all are really busy with all of this right now and just trying to like put one foot in front of the other. But eventually, is there any plan to take this work further out into the state or other areas? Like, we don't want other places to have to reinvent the wheel, and we're so far ahead. Are there any plans to kind of take the show on the road?
There is an immediate plan to take it into the Mid-Fork Coast Fork as we build out our second source. And we are helping the Santiam. But yes, I think, you know, there are some good lessons learned. We are talking to the American Water Works Association folks and, you know, some of these national associations, organizations to, in fact, I have a webinar on Monday to that point, to say, here's our lessons learned. This is how we responded. And these are kind of the benefits we see out of this, and kind of the heartaches that we experience mainly from like FEMA, because they're not used to locals taking this role on. And so it kind of threw them for a loop. I think they're used to it, or they've kind of grown with us to appreciate what we've done. But initially, as you know, they denied us reimbursement because they didn't think we're authorized to even do the work in the first place. So there is some learning happening, and I think, yeah, I think we are making an impression, or at least a statement across the state and the region of how we can respond to these disasters in a better way, with locals taking the lead.
Great. And my last comment is about just budget recommendations and the fee. I feel like if we've learned anything over these last 18 months is that just when you think all the turmoil and chaos is over, then something else happens. So it seems a little premature for us to say like, well, maybe we should think about not having that fee anymore or whatever, because who knows what's coming? What if we happen to have like a really, really wet year, or God forbid there's another fire event or something like that. So I think just knowing that we have that like built-in funding mechanism for now is really great. It is great to look ahead, and I'm guessing with the work that you have planned, there's plenty of ways that we can spend and invest that money and make a positive impact. So I support continuing the fee and just looking at opportunities that we can take advantage of with a fully funded program.
Thank you. I fully concur.
Yes, Frank.
Yes, commissioners, I know we're at time, so I'll be brief. I don't think Carl has ever proposed that the fee actually go away. I think what he was teeing up was the fact that we do have and planned on significant outside investment, and at some point, do we get to the point where we are expanding scope, or is there an opportunity? And it's probably not for a couple of years anyway, at least till 2023, to where we would actually look to mitigate the fee itself. So I don't think we're anywhere near there, and Carl would not be voting for that, even if we could. We've only, to Commissioner McCrae's point, we've only had a spattering of people who have, in one form or another, complained about the fee. Usually it was a misunderstanding of what the fee was going for. They thought it was an investment in electrical systems or something where, you know, they didn't feel like the water bill was the appropriate place for it, but usually it was a misunderstanding. And so that's just one piece of feedback. And the other one on the strategic piece is you'll hear a little bit more about that from Anna later around the environmental product line that we're developing. Part of what we've done is we have to have a product. And so we're in the product development mode for that. Some of it is we do have our heads up looking at the horizon and talking about some of these issues and exploring land acquisition issues or conservation easement issues or opportunities to both sequester carbon as well as protect the watershed. So those things are being pursued. We looked at those as opportunistic, and we just haven't found an opportunity yet to bring back to the board specifically that would rise to sort of your attention level. So there is work going on there. It's just hasn't risen to the specifics of coming back to the board yet. So more to come on that, and more actually in this meeting, even with Anna. So thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that, Carl. And we are now at our 5-minute break. Commissioner Borowski, I'm not sure if you're gonna join us after the break. You're doing a great job hanging in there.
Well, I'm just going to let you guys know that as intrigued I am with the strategic and operational plan, it's 5 a.m. here and I'm going to bed. So I'm going to leave the meeting at this point.
All right. Well, kudos to you for hanging in there for so long and having intelligent questions.
Good morning.
Okay, it is 7:57, so we'll just say that we come back at 8:05 if that's okay with everyone. Okay, see you all soon. All right, everyone is coming back at the very last second. Okay, so moving right along. Welcome back, everybody. With agenda item number 10, quarterly strategic and operational report.
Yeah, I'm just going to take this for Frank. Just seize it away from him. Good evening, commissioners. Before I go ahead and hand this over to the experts to give us some updates, I just want to set a little context for the quarterly report and why we're kind of taking this route tonight, which is a little different than what we've done in the past. So the quarterly report, of course, is a high level. They were meant to be a high level report of how the organization is operating or how we're doing with our goals, right? But I mean, you can see from Adam's report and Carl's report, there's a lot of details that go on underneath the organization. And one of the things Frank and I talked a little bit about is giving some daylight to some of these programs and projects that don't normally hit the quarterly report, or there's actually some current topics I think that you'll recognize from the headlines. You know, how does Eweb react to some of these things? So that's why we invited some folks in to come in and talk for us. One of the things, though, before I turn it over, is I wanted to address supply chains. We continue to see supply chain issues, just like most everybody in the world, if not the United States for sure. Most of those supply chain issues are in common items, simple items like conduit, ducting, pipes, pieces, parts. It's just a very similar story to what you read in the newspaper. One of the things, though, that is starting to impact this is, and I wanted to give you a little bit of a heads up, is electronic chips are also in short supply, you know, cars, all these things. Well, it's also impacting Eweb and our AMI smart meter, particularly the electronic meter supplies. So we had talked earlier in the year, I think, a little bit about a slowdown. At this point, we're now becoming concerned that we don't have enough meters to install and keep our deployment going. So haven't got all the details yet, but they're projecting delays of even up to 6 months or something like that before we start seeing meters. So again, we're still working on some of the details, and this is sort of hot off the press kind of information, but I just wanted to give folks a heads up that our deployment may be, especially in electric specifically, water will continue as normal. But, you know, I think the natural question is, you know, what is Eweb doing about this? One of the things we're really doing, this being the supply chain stuff, is we're monitoring and looking at shortages. Where are we going to be shorting? The purchasing department's working really hard and looking at projections, and even to the point where one of the consent items you approved tonight was the vault lids for the water meter boxes. That was that consent item was an RFP item, which basically focused on delivery, alternate supply chains, and some of these kind of non-traditional things where we're not just looking at price anymore. We're looking at availability, compatibility, safety was another item in this as well. So anyway, we're watching this stuff, we're monitoring it, doing the best we can, adjusting lead times, and I'm sure you'll probably hear more about this in different projects here and there. So with that little bit of context, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Julie.
All right, thank you, Rod. Good evening, commissioners. I am Julie McGahee, and I'm going to kick us off with a quick update on the customer portal. So the portal went live to customers on June 14th, and our goal is to match our previous customer participation by 90 days into the launch, which is actually coming up next week. So as you can see from the charts on the left, as of last week, we were at 117% of our registration target with over 44,000 customers signed up. And we're at 94% of our auto pay enrollment goal with over 20,000 accounts signed up. So for some perspective, it took us 8 years to get this many enrollments in our previous online payment system, and we have gotten here in just 11 weeks. This does help to explain why we are seeing such an increase in phone calls and emails and much longer hold times than we would like. In addition to the usual late summer volume that we just normally see, we have quite a few customers who would like to get assistance setting their accounts up all at once. So you can see from the chart on the right, we did a big communications push in the first few weeks of the launch to get customers moved over to the new system. The numbers are declining as we would expect, but we're still averaging 150 registrations each day and about 100 auto pay enrollments each day. We are currently in a transition period between supporting the launch of the new system and then looking at some new adoption campaigns to reach customers who maybe have never used Eweb's online systems before. So that is all I have on the portal, and next up is Greg Kelleher.
Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Greg Kelleher, Customer Operations Manager, and I'm here to update you on energy efficiency. So through August, we've achieved approximately 6,700 megawatt hours of energy savings. And with projected projects coming in the rest of the year, we expect to be surpass target and be slightly below budget. So the two charts side by side here are intended to illustrate the distribution of savings versus Eweb investment. This year, most of the savings have come from non-residential projects, but the majority of the cost is residential. Just for your reference and looking at the chart, 71% of the savings here on the chart on the left are non-residential, and only 39% of the Eweb investment on the chart on the right are non-residential. That's the gray areas. Typically, Eweb investment in residential savings is about, per kilowatt hour, is about double or triple, 57 cents typical for residential versus about 20 cents for commercial. And then limited income is about 7 or 8 times higher than the commercial, running about $1.50, $1.60 a kilowatt hour. So why the big difference? Part of it is because some commercial measures like LED lighting are less expensive per kilowatt hour of savings. The other part is, particularly for the limited income measures, Eweb is shouldering a higher percentage of the total cost of the measures. Just for reference on the graphs here, the aggregate investments, Eweb investments per kilowatt hour are kind of lower than typical because we've done a lot of commercial lighting this year, and that's really low cost. That's only about 12 cents a kilowatt hour versus, you know, some of the more expensive commercial measures in heating and cooling. And the other thing is that's not on the graph here is we mitigate some of the costs in our residential sector by offering zero interest loans, and they don't show up in this budget. So year to date, we have closed about just over $1 million, $1,060,000 in residential zero interest loans that we get back over a period of 4 to 5 years. So for reference on all this, commercial industrial sectors generate about 48% of retail sales or retail revenue, and but we only invest about 40% of our conservation funds to those sectors. But we have recently updated some of our incentive levels for the commercial industrial sectors to really kind of give ourselves a more efficient tool to tap into some of those savings, because there's a lot of potential savings in commercial HVAC, heating, ventilating, air conditioning, and lighting, and as well as new construction. So we've increased those incentives just a bit to help bring some more of those projects in. But just if we're going to continue to achieve our targets, we really have to look at balancing our offerings to kind of reduce investments in some of those super expensive measures to really kind of go after some more of those less expensive measures, or we'll need to increase our budget. So that's just something to think about going forward in the next few years. But so far so good, on target, just below budget. Next slide, please. So speaking of in the rental and multifamily activity, approximately 18% of our energy savings in single family homes are achieved in rental units. And there's a variety of sources out there around what percentage of single family homes are rentals. And depending on the source, we're slightly lagging there. It's in the range of 20 to 25%. So we're pretty close to parity with the percentage of our limited, pardon me, our efficiency activity in rentals versus owners, single family ownership homes. Historically, we're about 17 to 20%. So we're right on where we historically are generally. And also historically, about 15 to 25% of residential efficiency savings are in limited income dwellings. So just wanted to mention home energy scores. We've been partnering with University of Oregon and City of Eugene since 2017 on home energy scores. This is a way for tenants can apply. We've been marketing to rental units. Tenants can apply, and this empowers them to kind of initiate an assessment of their dwelling and possibly initiate upgrades by providing information to the property owner. Of course, with COVID, we had a little bit of slowdown, but we kind of pivoted to remote assessments. So using the data that we have and data that's available from other sources and questionnaires and conversations with the tenants, we're able to continue to provide those assessments. We have several opportunities and measures that we've initiated in the multifamily sector for efficient new construction. And one of the kind of standard and simple things that we have is a $450 or $1,100 per unit for this energy efficient or zero energy ready. And the energy efficient category is something like Earth Advantage, and that's usually about 10% better than code. And the zero energy ready is about 25% better than code. And what this is a list of kind of standard programs that would qualify for that, that are more regional. And in addition to the standard incentives, we do have a 20% premium for limited income nonprofits. And we have several other measures we're offering in this category. So just want to give you a brief summary of the multifamily activity this year. We've completed efficiency projects in 105 units in limited income nonprofits so far this year, and we have 138 units in progress. And that's a mix of retrofits in existing dwellings and also some new construction. And also in progress this year, we have 382 units they're not limited income specific, but they're 382 apartment units that are going through the energy efficient dwelling for $450 per unit. I think next we have Juan with some electrification news.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. Hello and good evening, commissioners, general manager, leadership team, members of the public, and fellow staff. My name is Juan Serpa Munoz, and I'm a business line manager on electrification and energy efficiency. Tonight, I will be sharing on Eweb's electric mobility efforts for 2021 and 2022. These are broken down into 6 areas you see on your screen and include an overview of proposed investment amounts by sector and year, which increased in 2022 as we further invest in Eweb-owned charging infrastructure, specifically in direct current fast charging. Funding for our electric mobility investments come from the monetization of clean fuel credits, and the intent of these efforts is to provide a comprehensive suite of programs to increase electric mobility while taking steps to bring access to this technology, provide affordable options for charging, create value for Eweb and our customers, and help us prepare to meet the energy demands of this increasing sector. Due to limited time, I cannot expand on the various programs of each section, but instead I'll highlight a few. A major area of investment will be Eweb-owned charging stations. These will provide a new revenue stream for our product of electricity, enable us to bring affordable costs for public electric mobility charging, and allow us to guide the operations of these stations, including calibration of delivered power, and if needed, calibration of delivered power when and as needed, with opportunities for demand response in the future. Efforts will be broken down into level 1 for electric micromobility, such as electric bikes, and level 2 in direct current fast charging, or DCFC, for electric automobiles. DCFC stations can provide very fast charging speeds, but can also be very expensive. A single station hardware can cost $30,000 to $75,000 or higher, depending on the power output, with installation costs of $25,000 to $50,000. These costs will drive the increase in investment in 2022 as we move forward with the installations of DCFC units and continue to expand and operate our charging infrastructure. In consideration of social equity in our efforts, we are looking at opportunities to bring access to this technology. The availability of electric vehicles does not necessarily mean the equitable access to them. So in this area, efforts cannot necessarily have a primary driver of financial return on investment, but a return of equitable access to electric mobility. A path to address this is the launching of an affordable housing EV sharing pilot program in partnership with St. Vincent de Paul, the City of Eugene, and Forth Mobility to provide charging infrastructure and an electric vehicle for the complex to share. Initially, we had 2 locations, but only one will be able to participate in the program. Additionally, electric mobility community grants will be offered to help community agencies implement efforts they need and in turn maximize the benefit for the populations they serve. We continue to have a residential and commercial charging station rebates, but we're expanding those to multifamily, employee, and workplace charging to help address future peak concerns, and adding rebates for the direct current fast charging stations. All of these efforts require the stations to meet the open ADR standard, which will allow for future demand response utility operations. When a business considers installing charging infrastructure, the process can be very complex and involved, including assessing the total power capacity needs of these stations and the cost of potential service upgrades. In response, and in addition to our rebates, we offer guidance and assessment of these capacity needs and a service upgrade loan to help with added costs. Quickly on the electric mobility rebates, we will offer rebates for electric bicycles, which can help displace internal combustion engine and electric vehicles to further reduce emissions. On the marketing side, we have various efforts, including the introduction of a citywide EV sharing pilot program at 2 identified locations. This effort is in partnership with the City of Eugene, Lane Transit District, and Forth Mobility to help bring access for the public to experience and use electric vehicles. With the current pandemic, vehicles will be cleaned regularly, and we will pause or stop the effort if needed. These guidelines will also apply to the affordable housing EV sharing pilot program mentioned earlier. In addition, we continue our ongoing Rev Up EV education classes, which are almost monthly and allow for attendees to take advantage of MSRP markdowns from participating local dealerships. This is an effort in partnership with the Emerald Valley Electric Vehicle Association, the City of Eugene, and other local entities and utilities. Lastly, on the partnership side, Eweb has access to total year electric vehicle registrations in our service territory. But through a partnership with the Oregon Department of Energy, we will receive GIS data with the actual locations of these vehicles, and this will help us evaluate electric vehicle adoption through various lenses, but also the potential impact to our grid and implement plans and work accordingly. Additionally, it will help us be more effective as we launch our various Eweb-owned charging infrastructure work. With this, I conclude my presentation. Thank you for your time today, board members. This is exciting good work to increase electric mobility and access while bringing value to our customers and Eweb. I will now pass it to my colleague, Anna Wade.
Thank you, Juan, and good evening, commissioners. For the record, I'm Anna Wade, Business Line Manager in Customer Solutions. As with Juan, I'm here tonight to share a sneak preview of a few environmental products that I'm currently working on. Cutting right to the chase, the primary goals for this product line are carbon mitigation and preparing customers for the resilient and efficient delivery future we envision in the strategic plan. This product line utilizes simple strategies to help get us there, namely market access, education through doing, incentives, and advancing carbon sequestration opportunities. So we're planning for a future in which our customers drive EVs and they charge them overnight during off-peak hours. They'll have smart meters and access to real-time consumption data to make sense of future Eweb price signals. And they'll have smart appliances, thermostats, and other tech enabled for demand response. Big projects like AMI and enterprise resource planning are prerequisite for this future. But in as much as we need to be prepared as a utility, we also need to bring our customers along. So the forthcoming environmental product lines represent near-term carbon solutions that can serve as stepping stones towards Eweb's vision of demand-supply alignment and carbon-friendly delivery of electricity and water. Can I get the next slide, please, Holly? Thank you. So I want to touch on 3 areas that are impacting the carbon conversation, and then specifically some product offerings related to each. So those are commodities, technology and behavior, and carbon sequestration. So as you'll recall, at the August board meeting, Jason gave a legislative update. Of note was the 100% clean energy standard to which gas utilities will be subject. Carbon offsets are the currency to which they will meet those requirements. For now, Eweb is exempt, so we'll continue to look at Oregon RPS, where RECs rule the day. Eweb's trade floor has access to both, and we can leverage that for our customers. Nationally and locally, businesses have a growing appetite for these environmental products. Beginning in Q4, we will offer retail REC sales to our customers. This will provide a more economic option for larger customers to advance operational goals that, as I said, increasingly include environmental impact. Minimum and maximum participation thresholds will enable planning staff to manage Eweb's REC portfolio in a prudent manner. We also want to offer carbon offsets. Offsets will allow all customers to address carbon above and beyond their energy consumption. By retailing carbon offsets, we can really showcase Eweb's low carbon portfolio, but also inform customer investments in things like solar or energy efficiency or transportation. Pricing for both product lines will be commodity based and approved by the board annually through the standard tariff pricing process. Also, I want to really quickly mention supply lines. Eweb has a pretty robust REC portfolio that is pre-existing. At the outset, carbon offsets will be market sourced until we bring along some of those projects that we're looking to the future where we can create a local supply line. Technology and behavior. So to achieve our vision, customers will have to accept new technology and find value in using it, which includes effective utilization of AMI and consumption data. There's typically 3 barriers to the adoption of new tech. There's cost, that's pretty obvious. Identifying value, so what's in it for me, and then finally privacy issues. So how can Eweb facilitate? Well, again, cost is the obvious one. We will offer customer incentives for smart thermostats and appliances. My partner Juan has done a lot of upfront work on that front. So, but the 3 of us, myself, Greg, and Juan, will be working together on advancing Eweb's incentives to address carbon in the coming year. In addition to encouraging customer adoption of technology, we aim to share power market dynamics through a Peak Hero program. Participants will receive info on things like time of use pricing, carbon intensity, and peak event alerts. This program will provide a no-cost option for customers to gain exposure on Eweb's playing field. So getting comfortable with these dynamics on a voluntary basis will help customers to identify value and develop confidence in adopting some of these new behaviors. Lastly, I want to talk about carbon sequestration projects. These can offer, as Carl's presentation indicated, these can offer dual benefits for source protection and potentially carbon offset generation in the future. The High Banks project with U of O, super cool project that will advance carbon forestry technology in our region and position Eweb to have a voice in protocol development. It's a super cool project that we can and should be really proud of, and we should invite our customers to be a part of it too. Voluntary subscriptions to fund the purchase of plant materials at the high banks or other future watershed sites will allow Eweb to stretch these investments and improve customer awareness in them. So Carl talked a little bit earlier about, where those watershed fee dollars are going and where they're not. This is a project where we can bring customers along to support them on a voluntary basis. Let's see. I'm also evaluating an urban tree planting program. A lack of tree canopy creates urban heat islands, which are disproportionately associated with lower income neighborhoods. Friends of Trees will be doing a grant-funded pilot program, planting and nurturing shade trees on residential properties and open spaces within these low canopy neighborhoods. Establishing a stable funding stream could create long-term benefits for energy conservation, social equity, neighborhood vitality, and then of course, carbon sequestration. Can I get the last slide, please, Holly? Thank you. So timeline, in Q4, we'll be rolling out the most basic components of this product line, providing market access to RECs and carbon offsets. To start, we'll focus on the most accessible market segment, so those early adopters, green innovators. Throughout 2022, we'll build upon and enhance these offerings to reach the mainstream through the Peak Hero program, through customer-facing tools for carbon calculation and incentives for smart technology. Over time, voluntary programs will give way to formal price signals and demand response. And again, that future where we really create efficiencies between our demand and supply and build those flexible spines. In conclusion, each of the product lines covered by Greg, Juan, and I can help our community address climate change and contribute to utility goals around stewardship and conservation and resiliency, of course. We'll be working collaboratively to develop Eweb programs using carbon as sort of our common currency and thinking with a sort of when matters communication strategy with our customers. It's really exciting work. I'm happy to be a part of it. And with that, I will pass it along to Megan.
Great. Thank you, Anna. Good evening, Commissioners. I'm Megan Capper, Energy Resources Manager, and I get to share with you how we managed our recent high temperature events, including our highest temperature on record for Sunday, June 27th. We know that temperatures drive customer demand, and in the table here, you can see Eweb's customer demand reached a peak of 407 megawatts in June. Our loads were also high in August, but I'm going to focus on June because, first of all, June is typically a more mild month, and we didn't anticipate high temperatures. And secondly, it was very well publicized 5 days prior. So it's a good time to ask ourselves what happened and what did we learn? Next slide, please. We did expect hotter temperatures and a strained resource stack this summer. And in spring, we received approval from our Risk Management Committee on our summer strategy. The strategy included maintaining adequate resources to cover a load for a 90-degree day. We planned to continuously incorporate new information and purchase additional generation for hotter days, but we didn't want to be any longer for those milder days. This strategy was for July through September. We did not have this strategy for June. So why was that? First of all, June's load volatility is generally low and our resources are generally very abundant. The latter was true in this June, thankfully, and we saw we were in a good position with enough regional resources. But let's look at a graph, next slide, at what we actually saw. It's more fun to look at a graph, I think. Here we have temperatures in blue and energy demand in orange, and they track together as you would expect. You can see the nights were not cooling off, and the highs and the lows each day increased, each consecutive day. You can really see this early Monday morning. The temperature at 3 a.m. was like 75 degrees. You probably all remember that because I know I did. So while Monday temperatures were lower, loads were on a trajectory to be higher than Sunday until the wind blew in cooler air. You can see this with the green line, decreasing the temperatures, and our loads soon followed. So next diagram. this is another way to look at this. It's a scatter diagram, and it shows Eweb's customer loads for all June hours, all days of the week, load and temperature. And this is from 2017 to 2020. In the green, you have just our June hot days, and the green circle represents Monday morning loads. Here you can clearly see at the lower temperatures, loads were significantly higher than any other historical point. So Monday morning shows that this situation was not only unprecedented, but by a large margin. So next slide. So we learned some lessons and we're translating them into future operations. This includes the importance of our load forecasts. We see that the past is not a good indication anymore of the future, actually, let alone the present. And we look forward to being able to include AMI data and customer survey data in our future forecasting. One thing we don't quite understand yet is the correlation of temperature to summer load. We don't have the granular information like how many AC units we have in our service territory or how they're growing. And we think of ourselves as a winter peaking utility, but as we start to see increased loads driven by these high temperatures, our past assumptions don't align with the future, and we need to do some work on that, and we recognize that. But the good news here is that staff successfully navigated a difficult situation. Another lesson learned, so next slide, please. Another lesson learned is that these extreme events, like I mentioned, they're not really unprecedented anymore. And so I want to briefly mention what the Northwest is doing to increase our trading partners and develop new market opportunities. And Eweb is part of these discussions. Here on this slide, this shows you how the Northwest markets operate today in the blue. So we currently buy and sell power. They're in hourly blocks. They're actually nighttime and daytime blocks. You probably heard heavy load hour and light load hour at some point. And we do it so bilaterally. So it's between two parties. And only in the day of delivery do we buy and sell on an hourly basis. Otherwise, it's these blocks. Well, the yellow represents opportunities in the Northwest to develop markets, like hourly automated markets prior to that actual day of, and 5-minute markets that are during the day. And these new efforts would provide automated matching of larger pools of buyers and sellers over smaller time periods. And next slide. On this slide, you can see the summary of discussions to develop these types of markets. And I know we've shared with you about several of them. So I want to focus down on the last one. Eweb is a member utility of the public generating pool, and the members commissioned a study to look at potential benefits of these markets, and early indications are promising for a utility like Eweb, where we could see a significant reduction in operating costs. And we think this is from more day-to-day, day-ahead hourly transactions instead of block. So instead of having to buy those blocks of 16 and 8 hours, we could actually buy individual hours according to our need. So I hope that provides you with some context around how we manage the heat events and are engaging in the regional energy issues. So next slide, and I think we have time for questions.
Okay. Commissioner McCray, I see your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Mindy. I have a whole bunch of questions because there was so much content there. That was like speed dating at Eweb. That was kind of awesome. Thank you for the rapid fire update on a bunch of fronts. So I'm going to assume that I'm probably not going to get all my questions answered, and I will follow up by email, if I may, with those presenters with whom I didn't have a chance to ask questions. I have one question that I think, a comment for Juan and a question for Frank about electric vehicles. Thank you for the presentation, Juan. I feel like you and I have talked before about Eweb's EV incentive program, and I feel like the continued emphasis on trying to reach lower income markets or lower income households, or those households that wouldn't have access to electric vehicles, and the affordability that comes with that is exactly where we should be. So I appreciate the effort and your focus in that arena specifically. The analysis that we just saw last month showed us that electric vehicles are competitive now, and we don't have to do a bunch of incentives, but it seems appropriate that we continue to work on those places where people wouldn't otherwise have access. So thank you. My question is, the other side of electrification, we've got a really robust EV program. I do wonder, Frank, how if we have somebody doing the same work as Juan on the building side, or if we have that in the works, or if that's in the plans in some way. It seems like there's the electrification study suggests that there's going to be required incentives and policy change in order to catalyze electrification of buildings. Just what's your thoughts on that front?
Yeah, so we do. So you met Greg as part of our overall efficiency. He's actually the manager over the customer solutions group. And I would expect that to initially fall within his purview as it develops further.
Great. Okay. Thank you. And then, if I may, I'm just going to take a couple more minutes to ask questions from Greg while you're there. Thank you for the presentation. It was a bunch of good information and some of it that I wasn't familiar with. You said we have a 10,000 megawatt hour target. I assume that's a target for just 1 year. Is that the same target year to year? Does our target tend to remain around 10,000 megawatt hours per year?
Historically, we've been varying it according to our methodology in the IERP, which is to offset 100% of load growth that isn't a large single load like a big new factory, but offsetting 100% of that growth with conservation. And we've been achieving that for several years in a row. We're holding at 10,000 megawatt hours for this year because we're experiencing some unexpected volatility in our loads due to COVID and its effect on the economy right now. So we really want conservation, our targets to be really based on more of a long-term growth and offsetting long-term growth rather than trying to offset it year to year. So that's approximately what it is, and we're holding there rather than saying let's do nothing this year and then let's do 40,000 next year. So
that makes sense.
About where we need to be.
Commissioner McCray, I would also add that there's a reimbursement from Bonneville, which is also part of what we take into account every year, and that varies a little bit every year, but it's been pretty consistent around the same level for the last several years. So we do take the reimbursement level and the targets from Bonneville into consideration.
Okay, that's helpful. How much more cost-effective energy efficiency exists in our area?
That's a great question. We do what's called the conservation potential assessment, and other utilities do this occasionally as well. We did it in 2012 with our IERP, and we found at the time there were over 85 average megawatts of conservation available. However, it's hard to take that and move it forward into the future because it does not consider new technology that arises. At the time we did the conservation potential assessment, for example, ductless heat pumps just barely made it in. They had just really started hitting the market. So since then we've had commercial LED lighting, residential LED lighting as well, and variable refrigerant flow technologies and a variety of new technologies, and we expect to continue to see that. So the short answer for that is there's a lot. There's always something that we can do. At any given time, I would estimate there's at least 80 average megawatts of conservation available. It's really not a question of how much is available. It's a question of really how much sense does it make to get it in terms of what it costs and what the other benefits are beyond the cost and what customers are willing to do to get it. Hope that helps.
Yeah, that's great.
McCray, I think it comes up this next year's the National Energy Efficiency Association does a regional building stock assessment, housing stock assessment, and there's information that we can glean out of that. I think that's due for its next report. I believe it's in 2022, but I'm not sure. But that also could inform us a little further as to what potential is available in some of these different market segments.
Okay,
Yes.
That's great.
Those studies repeat every 5 years. There's a residential and there's a commercial, and they really give us a good idea of what the baseline is now, so we can compare that with what the what potential measures might be available. So that's a really good point.
Great. All right, and 2 comments, and then I'll turn it over to somebody else. I am thrilled that we are seeing that we are investing in new multifamily construction to increase the energy efficiency in new buildings. So thank you, and I hope we'll continue to do that. And I'm thrilled to see that we have some tools to address the renter's paradox, where we're able to invest in energy efficiency in rental properties. That's fantastic. I'm curious to learn more about that, but I'll do that at a later time and turn the time over to somebody else. Thanks, Mindy.
Commissioner McCray, if you can send your questions to myself and Rod and Ann, and then we'll get them to the right people.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right. Commissioner Brown, did you have?
Just a couple of quick questions. Thank you. That was very informative. I like that format. About the supply chain issues, I know during Snowmageddon, a lot of our neighboring utilities ran out of things like poles and wire and transformers, and we lent them our supply. Now that we don't have the potential to resupply, is that going to change our policy on, you know, if we're down to limited things, and that puts our people at risk if we give out commodities such as that during a large event? Have we thought about that?
Yeah, I don't. I think really the answer, John, is that we look at every situation and request on its own basis, and so I think absolutely we would look at any request that comes to us at this point with the knowledge we have now of what we have and what we think we can get. So okay. You know, we really try and help each other out as much as possible. The utility operational world just thrives on that concept, and so you know, we try to honor where we can, but we're certainly not going to give away stuff that we need.
Okay, thank you. And the second one on I echo Matt's comments about helping the rental pool and energy efficiency, and I do a lot of work with Cornerstone and Homes for Good and things, but just a question on process. So when we subsidize like a Homes for Good project and make it energy efficient, the tenants of those buildings also qualify for the energy assistance program. And since we have limited income, do we limited resources? If somebody's living in, let's say, Bascom Village, and it's an energy efficient unit that we subsidize, do they also is there any criteria to say that you can or cannot qualify for the LIHEAP or any of those other programs that give energy assistance to limited income people?
No, sir. Those are treated completely independently. So your ability to get some sort of bill assistance, whether it be customer care or energy share or otherwise, is independent of whether you are just an electric customer, whether you're an electric and water customer, just a water customer, or where you live, or what your consumption or what your actual bill is. Those are 2 independent things altogether. Just where we are now.
So you can live and occupy one of the units that we provided the funding to subsidize, so their energy is low, and still qualify for assistance for based on your income. We're not. I just wanted to make sure because there's some people that don't get any assistance, and I was just wondering if maybe that's something that you may want to think about in the future. If somebody's utility bills are half of what, you know, living in a brand new apartment complex versus somebody that's living in a duplex where they have electric ceiling heat. I would hope we could spread our resources and not have somebody paying no utility bills and have other people paying a larger percentage of their income, especially the limited income people. Just a comment.
That's a great observation.
Yeah, Commissioner Brown, we've never used consumption as a criteria, and LIHEAP does not either, LIHEAP being the federal program, but that's something we're considering, especially if we provided these subsidies to drive the consumption down to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, it's just the concept of getting two benefits when somebody isn't getting any benefit. If there's a way to spread it out, it would be nice. But other than that, so thank you very much. I also have some extra questions, but I'm out of time, so I'll submit them in email.
Thank you.
Commissioner Carlson, did you have any questions or comments?
No, all mine have been answered. Thank you.
Okay, I have a few. That was a lot of information, and I kind of wrote furiously, so I'm gonna see if I can make sense of what I wrote. First of all, this is kind of neither here nor there, but I just want to point out that Sonia asked about supply chain issues, I think the first month of the pandemic in our in our board meeting. So that was very prescient, Sonia. I think that there's a lot of really exciting things that you've all talked about. I'm particularly interested in the rebates for electric bikes. I think that's great, and I can't wait to when we roll that out. I have a question about the rental unit, and I'm curious what percentage of renters that come to us for an energy audit end up taking advantage of some of our incentive programs, or their landlords do? I don't know if we have statistics on that.
That's a great question. That's something that we've tried to track it, and it's been a challenge to track because there's usually a pretty good time lag. So I do not have an answer for you today. We can explore that further and see if we can't get you something.
Okay. I'm just curious about the effectiveness, and also, I mean, it's great to have tenants be empowered. I'm just curious how much change they can actually make and how empowered they are to approach their landlords. So anyway, I'm just curious about that. I guess the one comment that I have is that what we've heard through this board meeting tonight are some really exciting incentives that Eweb is offering, like through the Mackenzie watershed restoration stuff, all of these programs. That's really great, but we can't incentivize our way through the climate crisis. And so I guess just my personal feeling as a board member, as we talk about strategic plans or policies or whatever, I want to make sure that we have these incentives, but that isn't our main effort in lowering our collective carbon footprint. So I just want to make sure that as we move forward, that we have policies that are climate friendly, but it's not only through incentives, if that makes sense. It's not very well formed, but that's just the thought that I have about incentives. And that the incentives sound really exciting too. So they're great, but I don't want that to be our only form of action. And I'll just leave it at that for now.
President Schlossberg, one of the things that we will talk a little bit about during our strategic work, and in a couple weeks, I believe it actually is, part of the premise of an alignment between supply and demand is that not only do you optimize financially, but you optimize environmentally. We know that consumption impacts the carbon footprint of the supply chain that we have, and that's both water and electric, and the resiliency thereof. And so the biggest piece of this, while it's strategic, it's also a little bit longer term, and there's things that we can do to help the customer. And so there's 5 things on in our climate change policy, one of which is to work with the customer through various incentives as far as electrification, as far as energy efficiency, conservation, and those types of things. But that's only one of 5. So there are some other things, and probably the biggest one having to do with our ongoing portfolio and our own carbon footprint within our operations.
Great, thank you. Okay, we are now going to move along toward the end of our agenda. Item number 11, correspondence and board agendas. And I just want to say thank you everybody for that presentation. It was great.
Yes, thank you. You know, it was a little bit different. Last month we had the opportunity to actually go through the report. The report was from last month, but I thought Rod captured it well. Taking a deeper dive into a few of these subjects, I think is worth doing every now and then. So I appreciate staff's attention to detail in all these matters. So thank you very much. Correspondence and board agendas. There were 2 pieces of correspondence. They both had to do with, I think, Deborah Hart. One was on the management letter follow-up. That was some follow-up to the management letter and the audit in April. And the other one had to do with the history of the rate stabilization fund and kind of where that came from and what it's used for. So I don't know if there were any questions on that, and if there are, we can answer those. I'll probably defer those to Deborah, but if not, we can just move on to board agendas as well. I'm not seeing any hand raised, so moving on to board agendas, we have quite a few activities coming up for the board. Probably the one that's on a number of people's minds is the joint meeting with the City of Eugene at the end of September. Between now and then, I believe it's September 14th, President Schlossberg and Matt McCray and myself, Commissioner McCray, are meeting with the mayor and council leadership. And so if there are particular items from the city that you would like on that agenda, it would probably be best to work through President Schlossberg and myself with just what those suggestions are. So far, we think that a climate action plan update would be a good update from their perspective to us, for example, and then from our end to them, kind of what's going on with electrification and resiliency, specifically on the water side. And so those are kind of 2 topics that we've teed up. This cannot be a meeting with a long presentation, given that there's 8 councilors, a mayor, and 5 commissioners, all with their opportunity to speak and interact. So we're going to try to keep any presentation really short. So we can do some background material, obviously, but that's kind of, if there's feedback that you want to provide, I'd suggest that Mindy, you be kind of the collector as well as myself and Ann, so we can review that with the city in a couple weeks. Oh, in a week actually. Other than that, I think everything's kind of out there and published. I don't have any further comments unless you have questions on board agendas. I think Commissioner Carlson had a question.
I was just curious, are they doing in-person meetings or are they still meeting virtually as well?
This meeting, this meeting, from my understanding, is going to be virtual.
Okay, thank you.
I don't see anything else, so that concludes that agenda item. So President Schlossberg, I'll turn it back to you.
Great. Well, we are on then our last item, which is board wrap up. I just want to thank the staff for all the presentations. Sometimes it's easy for me to forget to thank people because I'm so busy with my questions or running the meeting, but I just would like to let people know that I really appreciate the level of detail that goes into these presentations and their ability to answer all of our questions. And I know that it's not easy to give a presentation in normal times, but in this format, it's particularly difficult when you can't see people. So I just want to say that I really appreciate all the work that the staff is doing. both the ones who are presenting and the ones who are supporting this format. And that is it for me. Anybody want to jump in next? Nope, people are too tired.
I will. I just want to say thank you to everybody that did the presentation tonight. And most importantly, I'm really looking forward to the board dinner at Beppe and Gianni's. Thank you, Frank.
All right. Anybody else? You can jump in.
All right. Thanks again, Mindy, for herding the cats the way you do. Keeping us all in line. Much appreciated.
All right. Well, if there is nothing else, then we can all go home, or we can all get off our computers 19 minutes early.
I guess I better work on some dinner reservations.
It was a subtle hint, wasn't it?
Yeah. Commissioners, thanks for all of your participation, guidance, advice, support. It's really helpful. I know we're throwing a lot at you in a lot of different areas, and we're trying to pace it a little bit. At the same time, we know you have a very high capacity, so we are turning things up a little bit. So thank you.
Great. Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Have a good evening. Thank you.
Good night.